Picture this. The North Atlantic, April 1912. The water is unnervingly calm, a flat black mirror stretching out to vanish under a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars. It is a scene of profound peace, the kind that usually precedes a disaster. We all know the story that has been etched into our collective consciousness: the unsinkable ship, the sudden iceberg, the tragic, accidental end of an era. It is a narrative of nature humbling human arrogance, a clean, almost poetic tragedy. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the ice was just a convenient alibi for a much darker, more human act of violence? Grab a warm blanket and settle in, because the story we are about to unravel is not the one you learned in school. This is not just a tale of a shipwreck. It is a cold case file that has been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for over a century. We are stepping into a world where European empires were locked in a silent, paranoid arms race, where submarines were the new sea monsters, and where the sinking of a British icon might have been a calculated move on a geopolitical chessboard. Tonight, we are investigating the theory that the Titanic didn't just hit an iceberg, she was hunted. This is a journey into the shadows of 1912, looking for the torpedo that history erased. If you'd like to follow more investigations like this, consider subscribing for future episodes. To understand why a century-old tragedy might actually be a cold case of mass murder, we must first strip away the romantic varnish that Hollywood and history books have applied to that night. We must look past the string quartets playing on the deck and the tearful farewells at the lifeboats to focus on the cold, hard mechanics of the destruction itself. The official story relies on a singular, almost innocent collision: an iceberg, a natural monolith, brushing against the ship's flank. But the crime we are investigating proposes a far more violent and calculated event. The theory posits that the RMS Titanic was not the victim of bad luck or a moonless night, but the target of a deliberate, covert strike by the Imperial German Navy. This was not a traffic accident at sea. It was an assassination of the pride of the British Empire, executed with such precision and stealth that the world is still debating the weapon used. The heart of this mystery, and the core of the alleged crime, lies in the dissonance between what we are told happened and what the people on board actually experienced. An iceberg collision is a grinding, scraping affair. It is a slow, agonizing friction of ice against steel plates, a sound like tearing canvas magnified 1,000 times, and indeed some passengers reported exactly that. But they were not the only voices. Buried in the transcripts of the 1912 inquiries, ignored by the headlines of the day, are the testimonies of survivors who described something entirely different. They spoke of explosions, not the groan of metal under stress, but the sharp, percussive booms of detonation. Major Arthur Pushen, a first-class passenger with military experience, described a sound that he felt was certainly an explosion. Others, deep in the bowels of the ship, reported a bang that shook the floorboards beneath their feet long before the water began to rise. These were not the sounds of a passive collision. They were the acoustic signatures of a weapon. If we entertain the possibility of a torpedo, the crime transforms from negligence to an act of war committed during a time of peace. In 1912, the torpedo was the ultimate predator of the deep, a weapon that struck from the shadows without warning. A German U-boat, lurking in the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic, could have easily tracked a behemoth like the Titanic. The ship was lit up like a floating carnival, visible for miles, its massive reciprocating engines churning the water and creating a sonic footprint that any submarine commander could follow with ease. The crime here would be the deliberate targeting of a civilian vessel, a violation of maritime law and human decency, so profound that it would have ignited World War I 2 years ahead of schedule. But it is also a crime of opportunity. The Titanic was not just a luxury liner. She was a British asset, a reserve cruiser for the Royal Navy in times of war, and a symbol of the technological dominance Germany was desperate to shatter. Consider the physics of the sinking, which has puzzled naval architects for decades. The Titanic was designed to be robust, a honeycomb of 16 watertight compartments. She could stay afloat with 4 of them flooded. The iceberg theory demands that we believe the ice caused a continuous razor-thin slit across 5 or 6 compartments. a kind of damage that is statistically unlikely and physically difficult for a rounded mass of ice to inflict on flexible steel plates. However, a torpedo, or a salvo of 2 torpedoes, creates a different kind of trauma. A torpedo warhead detonating against the hull does not just cut, it shatters. It sends a shockwave through the water that acts like a hammer, popping rivets and buckling plates over a wide area. This matches the catastrophic, rapid flooding that doomed the ship in under 3 hours. The crime, therefore, is found in the wound itself, a lethal injection of water delivered by high explosives, disguised by the convenient presence of drift ice in the vicinity. The perpetrators of this alleged crime would be the commanders and crew of a German U-boat, operating perhaps under loose orders to test their capabilities against British shipping, or perhaps acting as rogue agents in a tense geopolitical climate. But the list of accomplices in this mystery potentially extends much further, reaching into the highest offices of London and Washington. This is where the narrative shifts from a simple attack to a complex conspiracy. If British intelligence suspected a German attack, why cover it up? The answer lies in the terrified calculus of 1912. The world was a powder keg. Britain was not ready for a total war with Germany. Admitting that the Titanic had been torpedoed would have demanded an immediate military response, a response the Empire could not yet afford. It was far more convenient, far safer to blame the ice. The iceberg had no politics. The iceberg could not be sued. The iceberg would not start a war that would kill millions. And so, the crime is twofold. First, the act of violence itself, the cold-blooded firing of a torpedo into a ship carrying women, children, and civilians, a test of naval power that cost 500 lives. Second, the cover-up, the systematic silencing of witnesses who heard explosions, the dismissal of reports of strange lights on the horizon, and the rapid closure of inquiries that were more interested in reassuring the public than finding the truth. This theory suggests that the Titanic is not just a graveyard. It is a crime scene that has been tampered with by history itself. The evidence, the bent steel, the scattered debris field, the inconsistent testimonies, lies 12,000 feet down, protected by crushing pressure and the silence of the deep. This perspective forces us to re-examine every shadow on the deck that night. When Captain Smith looked out over the bridge, did he see the white wake of a torpedo streaking through the phosphorescent water? When the ship first shuddered, did the engineers in the boiler rooms know instantly that this was no iceberg? The terror of the passengers takes on a darker hue when you realize they might have been casualties of a secret conflict they didn't even know was being fought. The narrative of the unsinkable ship sinking due to hubris is tragic, but the narrative of the unsinkable ship being assassinated is horrifying. It implies that the passengers were not just unlucky, they were pawns in a deadly game of empires, sacrificed to keep the peace for just a few more years. As we delve deeper into this investigation, we must keep this possibility alive in our minds. We are looking for the fingerprints of a machine designed to kill, hidden amidst the chaos of a natural disaster. We are listening for the echo of an explosion that was drowned out by the screams of the dying and the rush of the ocean. The crime is the sinking. The suspect is the German Navy, and the motive is the oldest one in the book: power. What happened that night changed the world, but perhaps not for the reasons we have always believed. The ice may have been the weapon that finished her off, or the shroud that hid the wound, but was it truly the killer? Or was there something else, something metallic and man-made, waiting in the black water, watching the great ship approach with the cold patience of a predator? The water is deep, the silence is heavy, and the truth is waiting to be brought to the surface. To see the crime clearly, we must first step back from the edge of the lifeboat and look at the world that built the ship. The year 1912 is often remembered through a haze of sepia-tone nostalgia, a final golden summer of garden parties and rigid manners before the guns of August shattered the silence 2 years later. But this view is a dangerous illusion, a trick of memory that hides the rot beneath the gilding. In reality, the Edwardian era was not a time of innocence. It was a time of ferocious, unchecked ambition and suffocating paranoia. To understand why the Titanic might have been targeted and why her destruction might have been covered up, One must understand that she was launched not into a calm sea, but into a geopolitical storm that was already raging in everything but name. The North Atlantic was not merely a commercial highway. It was the contested frontier of a Cold War between the fading sun of the British Empire and the rising ironclad shadow of Imperial Germany. This was the age of the dreadnought, a time when the measurement of a nation's soul was the tonnage of its steel and the caliber of its guns. Kaiser Wilhelm II, envious of his British grandmother's navy, was obsessively building a fleet designed to challenge the Royal Navy's supremacy. This naval arms race was the drumbeat beneath every diplomatic conversation in Europe. Every rivet driven into a British hull was seen in Berlin as a threat. Every German keel laid down was seen in London as an act of aggression. In this poisonous atmosphere, the RMS Titanic was not simply a cruise ship for the wealthy or a ferry for the hopeful poor. She was a strategic asset, a floating declaration of British technological dominance. She was subsidized by the government with the explicit understanding that, in the event of war, she could be requisitioned, armed, and turned into a troop transport or an auxiliary cruiser. To the German Admiralty, she was a legitimate future target, a military reserve disguised in velvet and oak. Simultaneously, the commercial pressure acting upon the White Star Line was immense, creating a corporate culture where safety was a distant second to prestige. The company was locked in a brutal battle for passengers against its British rival Cunard and the aggressive German lines like Hamburg America and North German Lloyd. The Germans were building faster, more luxurious ships, stealing the lucrative immigrant trade that fueled the Atlantic economy. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star, was a man who felt this pressure in his bones. He needed a triumph. He needed the Olympic-class liners to be untouchable, symbols of size and splendor that would render speed irrelevant. This desperation fostered a kind of corporate hubris that bordered on criminal negligence. It created a mindset where schedules were sacred and caution was seen as a lack of confidence. It was this very environment that allowed the ship to steam at nearly full speed into a known ice field, but it also provided the perfect cover for a foreign power to strike. If a ship is known to be reckless, its destruction is easily blamed on its own captain. The regulatory framework of 1912 was equally complicit in the disaster, creating loopholes that a saboteur or attacker could exploit with terrifying ease. The British Board of Trade, the agency responsible for maritime safety, was operating on regulations that were hopelessly outdated, written for a time when ships were a quarter of the size of the Titanic. The famous lack of lifeboats, enough for only a third of the passengers, was not a legal violation. It was a compliance with obsolete laws that simply hadn't caught up to modern engineering. But there was a darker logic at play as well. The prevailing belief was that modern ships were their own lifeboats. They were designed with watertight compartments and double bottoms. The idea of a catastrophic, rapid sinking was dismissed as a fantasy. This blind faith in technology meant that no one was watching the horizon for a periscope, and no one was listening for the hum of an electric torpedo motor. They believed they were inside a fortress, when in fact they were inside a target. Furthermore, the social stratification of the era played a critical role in how the accident was perceived and investigated. The Edwardian world was rigidly hierarchical, a place where the word of a gentleman like Captain Smith or Bruce Ismay was taken as fact, while the observations of stokers or steerage passengers were often dismissed. If a third-class passenger claimed to see a searchlight on the water, or a stoker spoke of an explosion that didn't sound like ice, who would listen? The class system acted as a filter for the truth, allowing inconvenient narratives to be discarded as the ramblings of the uneducated or the hysterical. This social blindness was the perfect soil for a conspiracy to take root. If the powerful decided that the iceberg story was the necessary truth to prevent a stock market collapse or a premature war, the machinery of the state and the press would align to make it so. This volatile mixture of military tension, commercial desperation, and regulatory failure created the perfect conditions for the crime we are investigating. The Titanic was sailing through a world that was already at war in the shadows. German U-boats were patrolling the Atlantic, testing their range and their stealth. probing the defenses of British shipping lanes. These were not the primitive submersibles of fiction, but complex machines capable of deadly surprise. In 1912, the concept of unrestricted submarine warfare had not yet been unleashed on the world, but the capability was there, and the temptation to humiliate Britain by snapping its greatest spine was palpable. Thus, when we look at the Titanic steaming west on that April night, we must see her not just as a tragedy waiting to happen, but as a victim walking into an ambush. The iceberg was real, certainly. The North Atlantic is littered with them in spring. But in a world where empires were itching for a fight, was the iceberg the only danger in the water? Or was it merely the stage prop that allowed a dark actor to exit the scene unseen? The context of 1912 screams with motive. The British wanted to project invincibility, the Germans wanted to prove vulnerability. The collision of these two desires, amidst the freezing waters and the corporate greed, set the stage for a disaster that looks less like an accident and more like a liquidation. The world was ready for violence. It was only waiting for the first shot to be fired, or in this case, the first hull to be breached. To understand the drama that unfolded in the freezing dark, we must first look into the faces of the players who walked the stage. A tragedy of this magnitude is not merely a collection of statistics or a list of the dead. It is a collision of specific lives, personalities, and secrets. In a standard criminal investigation, we would pin their photos to a corkboard, connecting them with red string. Here we must pull them from the sepia fog of history and see them as they were, breathing, anxious, ambitious, and perhaps complicit. The cast of this mystery includes a beloved captain who may have been guarding a dangerous secret, a perfectionist architect who realized the truth too late, a corporate tycoon desperate to save his reputation, and a phantom enemy watching from beneath the waves. Center stage stands Captain Edward John Smith, a man who looked every inch the maritime patriarch. With a white beard that seemed sculpted from sea foam and a gaze that commanded absolute authority, Smith was the millionaire's captain, the man the ultra-wealthy trusted with their lives. At 62, he was preparing for retirement. The Titanic's maiden voyage was meant to be his swan song, a final, glorious lap of honor before a quiet life on land. History paints him as a stoic hero who went down with his ship, but the lens of our investigation suggests a more complex figure. Smith was not just a sailor, he was a company man, deeply embedded in the politics of the White Star Line and, by extension, the British establishment. If there were warnings of German naval activity, confidential naval intelligence shared with commanders of Royal Mail ships, Smith would have been the one to receive them. Was his apparent casualness regarding the ice warnings a sign of negligence, or was it the behavior of a man distracted by a different, more specific threat? Some observers on the bridge noted a strange detachment in his demeanor that night, a heaviness that went beyond the fatigue of command. Was he scanning the horizon for icebergs, or was he watching for the telltale feather spray of a periscope? Walking in Smith's shadow was Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer and the nephew of Lord Pirrie, the chairman of Harland and Wolff. Andrews was a man of facts, a pragmatic perfectionist who carried a notebook everywhere, obsessively recording minor flaws, a rubbing door, a noisy fan, a color scheme that didn't quite work. He loved the Titanic with the fierce protective intensity of a creator. He knew the tensile strength of every steel plate and the capacity of every pump. In our investigation, Andrews is the expert witness whose testimony was cut short by death. When the collision occurred, Andrews was the first to realize the mathematics of the disaster did not add up. He knew the ship was designed to float with 4 compartments flooded. If he saw damage that spanned 5 or 6 compartments, damage that shattered the hull plates rather than slicing them, he would have been the one man capable of distinguishing between an iceberg's scrape and a torpedo's concussion. His final moments, staring blankly at a painting in the smoking room, are often interpreted as shock. But perhaps it was the crushing realization that his masterpiece had been murdered, and that the physics of the destruction pointed to a weapon he had never designed her to withstand. Then there is the antagonist of the traditional narrative, J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. History has unkindly labeled him J. Brute Ismay, the coward who stole a lifeboat seat while women and children died. But in a criminal context, Ismay's role shifts from coward to potential conspirator in the cover-up. Ismay was the bridge between the ship and the boardroom. He was the man who allegedly urged Smith to increase speed, to make headlines, to beat the competition. If the ship was attacked, Ismay would have been the first to understand the catastrophic financial and political implications. A torpedoing would mean war, insurance battles, and the total loss of confidence in British shipping. An iceberg accident, however, could be spun as an act of God, a tragedy of nature. Ismay survived the sinking, and in the hours and days that followed, he was secluded, sending wireless messages that were intercepted and sometimes suppressed. Was he managing the narrative before he even reached New York? Was he the architect of the silence that followed? But a crime requires witnesses, and the Titanic carried men who knew the sound of violence. Major Arthur Pushen was a Canadian businessman, but also a military officer with the Queen's Own Rifles. He was not a nervous tourist. He was a man trained to identify the sounds of ordnance. On the night of the sinking, Pushen did not describe a grinding noise. He explicitly described a heavy thud, a sound he associated with a detonation. He was not alone. In the investigations file, we find the forgotten voices of stokers and firemen, men like Frederick Barrett in Boiler Room 6. They spoke of a thunderous crash, of water rushing in with violence that sent them scrambling for their lives. These were men who worked next to the ship's skin. They felt the blow intimately. Their descriptions often mirror the concussive force of an explosion rather than the progressive tearing of a collision. These are our credible witnesses, the ones whose accounts were smoothed over and blended into the iceberg consensus by the official inquiries. Finally, we must introduce the phantom in the water, the commander of the German U-boat. While we cannot name him with certainty, records from the Imperial German Navy were notoriously purged after both World Wars. We can sketch his profile based on the men who commanded the U-boat fleet in 1912. He would have been young, aristocratically arrogant, and eager to prove the worth of his new, unproven weapon. The submarine service was the rogue arm of the Navy, operating with a level of autonomy that bordered on piracy. He would have been prowling the North Atlantic shipping lanes, perhaps under orders to conduct reconnaissance, perhaps acting on his own initiative to test his targeting drills against the largest moving object in the world. He is the ghost in our machine, the man peering through the lens, his finger hovering over the firing solution. Did he intend to sink her or just to cripple her? Did he mistake her for a troop transport in the dark? Or was it a cold-blooded test of a torpedo's yield against modern armor? Bringing these figures into the present is the modern forensic expert, the successor to the men who found the wreck in 1985. Men like Dr. Robert Ballard and the subsequent naval architects who have analyzed the debris field. They are the cold case detectives. They look at the banjo string tension of the rivets, the brittle fracture of the steel, and the peculiar outward buckling of certain hull plates. They use sonar maps to argue that the damage is inconsistent with a continuous gash. They are the ones who keep the alternative theory alive, not with conspiracy theories, but with metallurgy and physics. They point out that the iceberg, as described, would have had to perform a geometrically impossible maneuver to inflict the reported damage. Through their eyes, we see the crime scene as it lies today, a broken giant that took its secrets to the grave, guarded by the crushing pressure of the deep. As the Titanic steamed toward her rendezvous with history, these characters were moving through their final acts. Smith was dining in the saloon, perhaps masking his anxiety with a cigar. Andrews was in his stateroom, poring over blueprints, unknowingly studying the very anatomy that was about to be violated. Ismay was dreaming of New York headlines. Pushen was likely preparing for bed, unaware that his military training was about to be tested. And out there in the black water, the hunter was potentially bringing his vessel to periscope depth, calculating speed and distance. The stage was set not for an accident but for an execution. The collision of these lives would generate a shockwave that we are still feeling today, a century later. The innocent, the guilty, and the unsuspecting were all trapped in the same steel cage, racing at 22 knots toward a moment that would shatter the peace of the Edwardian world forever. The evening of April 14th arrived dressed in a deceptive, terrifying beauty. It was the kind of night that painters dream of and sailors secretly dread, where the line between the ocean and the sky dissolves into a single seamless void of indigo. The sun had set in a blaze of violent orange and bruised purple, a spectacular display that drew passengers to the railings, unaware that they were watching the final daylight of an era fade into history. As the twilight deepened, the Atlantic became unnervingly still. There were no waves, no whitecaps, not even the gentle swell that usually breathes life into the ocean. The water was a sheet of black glass, reflecting the blazing lights of the Titanic with such clarity that the ship seemed to be suspended in a void of stars, floating between the heavens and the abyss. It was a perfect night for a crossing, and as it would turn out, a perfect night for an ambush. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was one of aggressive, defiant luxury, a deliberate insulation against the primitive cold waiting just inches beyond the steel hull. The Titanic was not merely a mode of transport, she was a floating stage where the Edwardian elite performed the rituals of their caste. In the first-class dining saloon, the air was thick with the scents of expensive tobacco, hothouse flowers, and heavy French sauces. The room was a vast, glowing cavern of Jacobean splendor, paneled in oak and illuminated by the soft electric shimmer of crystal chandeliers. Here, the crime scene was set with silver cutlery and spode china. The victims were dining on a menu that read like a challenge to the austerity of nature. Oysters à la Russe, consommé Olga, poached salmon with mousseline sauce, filet mignon lily. Each course was a testament to the logistical miracle of the White Star Line, a declaration that civilization had finally conquered the wild. At the captain's table, Edward Smith played the role of the benevolent monarch. He was dining as a guest of the Wideners, surrounded by the wealthiest people on the planet. The conversation likely flowed through the predictable channels of the time: the recent coal strikes, the suffragette movement, the impossible size of this new ship. They toasted to the Queen, to the President, and to the maiden voyage, their glasses clinking with a sound that would soon be replaced by the screaming of twisting metal. There is a profound, almost sickening irony in visualizing this scene through the lens of a criminal investigation. These men and women, masters of the universe, were sitting in the crosshairs. They believed they were in the safest place on Earth, protected by money and technology, while in reality, they were dining inside a lit-up target moving at 22 knots through a dark shooting gallery. Further aft, in the a la carte restaurant, managed by the perfectionist Luigi Gatti, the atmosphere was even more exclusive. This was the sanctuary for those who found the main dining saloon too common. Here, Benjamin Guggenheim, dressed in evening wear that cost more than a crew member's annual salary, held court with his mistress and valets. The tables were adorned with pink roses, the lighting was intimate, and the music from the ship's orchestra drifted in from the reception room, tunes from The Merry Widow and The Chocolate Soldier. It was a bubble of warmth and light, a fragile ecosystem of wealth that felt entirely permanent. The idea that this room, with its French walnut paneling and silk curtains, would be filled with freezing salt water in just a few hours was a cognitive dissonance too great to entertain. They were eating, drinking, and laughing in the belly of a beast that was already marked for death. Down in the deeper decks, the rhythm of life was different but equally vibrant. In the third-class general room, the air smelled of cheaper tobacco, beer, and the collective hope of 1,000 immigrants. The steerage passengers were not dining on filet mignon, but they were feasting on the dream of America. An impromptu Tayleid had broken out, fueled by Eugene Daly's bagpipes. The sharp, mournful wail of the pipes cut through the noise of the engines, a sound of home for the Irish passengers leaving everything behind. Men played cards with worn decks, betting pennies they couldn't afford to lose, while young women danced with a freedom that would have scandalized the ladies in first class. In this crowded, noisy, vibrant space, there was no pretense, only the raw energy of human ambition. They were the unsuspecting collateral damage in this potential crime, the ones who would find the gates locked when the water began to rise. But outside this envelope of light and noise, the night was turning hostile. The temperature dropped with a sudden, brutal sharpness that experienced sailors recognized as the breath of ice. It plummeted from a brisk 43 degrees to a freezing 31 degrees in a matter of hours. The decks cleared as passengers retreated to the warmth of the lounges and libraries, leaving the ship's exterior deserted. This abandonment turned the Titanic into a ghost ship on the outside, a massive, silent projectile hurling itself into the dark. The cold was a physical barrier, a warning that the environment had changed, that the ship had crossed an invisible line into enemy territory. For a submarine commander watching through a periscope, the drop in temperature would have fogged the lens, requiring constant clearing as he tracked the blazing row of portholes gliding across his field of vision. High up in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were miserable. Exposed to the freezing slipstream created by the ship's speed, they were practically blinded by the tears freezing in their eyes. They had no binoculars, a detail often cited as negligence, but perhaps just a cruel twist of fate. They were staring into a black hole, a sea so flat it offered no breaking waves to reveal the base of an iceberg. But if we consider the attack theory, their blindness takes on a more sinister significance. A submarine running on electric motors at the surface, or sitting low in the water to recharge, would have been nearly invisible against the black ocean. Without optics, the lookouts were trying to spot a phantom. They were looking for white ice, not the grey steel of a conning tower. The silence of the ocean was total, broken only by the hiss of water peeling away from the bow and the deep, rhythmic throb of the engines, a heartbeat that was about to stop. As the clock ticked past 11:00 p.m., the ship began to settle down. The stewards in the first-class corridors moved with hushed efficiency, laying out nightclothes and turning down beds. The lights in the public rooms were dimmed. The smoke in the gentlemen's smoking room grew thicker as the die-hard card players, like the uncompromising Alhambra, refused to end their bridge games. The Titanic was entering its most vulnerable state, a sleeping giant, its guard down, its thousands of souls drifting into dreams. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were exhausted, working through a backlog of passenger messages, ignoring the mundane warnings of ice from other ships. They were the ears of the Titanic, but they were deaf to the real danger. They were listening to the chatter of society, not the silence of the hunter. This moment, frozen in time just before 11:40 p.m., is the calmest, most heartbreaking scene in the entire story. It is the deep breath before the scream. The ship is a masterpiece of engineering and arrogance, cutting a phosphorescent wake through the Atlantic. Inside, babies are sleeping in cribs, lovers are whispering in the shadows of the boat deck, and stokers are wiping coal dust from their sweating faces. It is a world complete unto itself, confident in its permanence. But in the context of a crime, this is the moment the assassin steps out of the shadows. The weapon is loaded. The target is acquired. The distance is closing. The peace of the night is not a blessing, it is a camouflage. The Titanic is not sailing toward a tragic accident. She is sailing into a trap set by the convergence of politics, technology, and the darkest impulses of human conflict. And as the minute hand creeps toward the fatal number, the last peaceful moment of the Edwardian age is about to be shattered by a sound that doesn't belong to nature. The first cracks in the illusion of safety appeared not in the hull, but in the invisible web of communication that tethered the Titanic to the rest of the world. In any modern criminal investigation, the timeline of the disaster begins long before the fatal blow is struck. It begins with the breakdown of protocols, the missed signals, and the inexplicable silences that allow a tragedy to unfold. On the Titanic, these were not merely unfortunate glitches, they were a systemic blinding of the ship, a series of failures so precise and so catastrophic that they feel less like bad luck and more like the deliberate severance of a lifeline. If a predator were stalking the great liner, the first move would be to isolate the prey, to ensure that when the attack came, the victim would be deaf, dumb, and alone in the dark. The nerve center of this isolation was the Marconi wireless room, a cramped, buzzing cabin located on the boat deck. Here, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride presided over the cutting edge of Edwardian technology, a spark-gap transmitter capable of sending Morse code over hundreds of miles. But in the days leading up to April 14th, the equipment had failed. For nearly a full day, the set was dead, a malfunction that caused a massive backlog of passenger messages to pile up. When the machine was finally repaired, the operators were exhausted and under immense pressure to clear the stack of social greetings and stock tips that the wealthy passengers had paid to send. This commercial pressure created a dangerous filter. The wireless room ceased to be a navigational safety tool and became a frantic telegraph office for the rich. It was in this chaotic environment that the warnings began to slip through the cracks or perhaps were shoved aside. Throughout the day, the Titanic received multiple warnings of ice from other ships, the Coronia, the Baltic, the America. These were not vague advisories. They were specific coordinates pointing to a massive field of pack ice and icebergs directly in the ship's path. Yet, the handling of these messages was bizarrely negligent. The message from the America, received in the early afternoon, warned of 2 large icebergs. It was passed not to the bridge, but to the hydrographic office for unrelated processing. Why? Was it simple incompetence, or was the bridge already distracted by other concerns? The most damning silence came later in the evening, around 9:40 p.m., when the steamer Mesaba sent a desperate warning. Saw much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice. This message effectively drew a map of a minefield directly in front of the Titanic. It never reached the bridge. Jack Phillips, overwhelmed by the backlog and the deafening static of the Cape Race station, simply set it aside under a paperweight. In a criminal context, that paperweight was a lethal weapon. It blinded Captain Smith to the exact nature of the wall he was steaming toward. But there were other, more physical signs that the ship was wounded before the voyage even began. Deep in the bowels of the vessel, in coal bunker number 6, a fire had been smoldering since the ship left Belfast. Spontaneous combustion in coal bunkers was a known hazard, but this was no minor flicker. It was a raging furnace that heated the steel bulkhead to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, warping the metal and compromising its structural integrity. The fire was kept secret from the passengers, a dirty reality hidden beneath the pristine decks. Stokers worked around the clock to dig out the burning coal and feed it into the furnaces, which ironically forced the ship to maintain a higher speed to consume the fuel. This creates a disturbing picture, a ship racing at full speed not just for prestige, but because she was burning from the inside out. If a torpedo or an iceberg were to strike near that weakened bulkhead, which is exactly where the impact eventually occurred, the steel would have shattered like glass rather than bending. Was this fire a result of negligence, or was it an act of sabotage from the very start? As the night wore on, the visual environment became as treacherous as the radio silence. The calm that settled over the ocean was unnatural. Without waves breaking against the base of obstacles, there was no phosphorescence, the telltale white foam that usually alerted lookouts to danger in the dark. But there was something else happening, a phenomenon known as cold water mirage. The freezing Labrador current was meeting the warm Gulf Stream, creating a thermal inversion that bent the light. This optical distortion raised the horizon line, creating a false horizon that masked objects in the distance. The stars seemed to dip down into the water, blurring the boundary between sea and sky. For the lookouts, it was like staring into a kaleidoscope of darkness. This condition, known as superrefraction, would have hidden an iceberg until it was seconds away. But it would also have been the perfect cloak for a submarine. A U-boat commander, sitting low in the water, would be hidden by the same optical trick, invisible until the torpedo was already in the water. Suspicious behavior was also noted on the bridge of the neighboring ship, the SS Californian. Under the command of Captain Stanley Lord, the Californian had stopped for the night, surrounded by ice. Lord claimed to see another ship approaching, a mystery ship that didn't behave like the Titanic. He described a vessel of moderate size, moving strangely, which eventually stopped and turned away. Was this the Titanic distorted by the mirage, or was Lord seeing the third ship, the aggressor? The Californian tried to signal this mystery vessel with a Morse lamp, but received no intelligible reply, only flickering lights that looked like erratic flashes. Were these the clumsy attempts of a submarine trying to communicate, or the muzzle flashes of a signal gun? The failure of the Californian to establish contact is one of the great what-ifs of the night, but in our investigation, it suggests that the waters were crowded with more than just commercial traffic. Back on the Titanic, the behavior of the senior officers was marked by a strange, almost fatalistic detachment. Captain Smith cancelled the scheduled lifeboat drill that Sunday morning. Why? On a maiden voyage with a new crew and untried equipment, A drill is essential. Cancelling it seems like a dereliction of duty, unless Smith wanted to avoid drawing attention to the lifeboats. Was he afraid of alarming the passengers, or did he believe the ship was unsinkable to the point of arrogance? The lack of a drill meant that when the order to abandon ship finally came, the crew was disorganized, the passengers were confused, and chaos reigned. It was a decision that turned a disaster into a massacre. Then came the final brutal exchange that sealed the silence. At 11:00 p.m., the wireless operator on the Californian, Cyril Evans, tried to warn the Titanic one last time. "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." It was a lifeline thrown across the dark water. Jack Phillips, his ears ringing with the static of the relay station at Cape Race and his patience frayed by hours of work, snapped back, shut up, I am busy, I am working Cape Race." Evans, insulted and tired, turned off his radio and went to bed. The lifeline was cut. The Titanic was now officially deaf. This exchange is often cited as the ultimate example of stress and rudeness, but it functioned as the final lock on the trapdoor. By silencing the only ship close enough to help, Phillips inadvertently ensured that the Titanic would face her attacker, be it ice or iron, completely alone. As 11:35 p.m. approached, the ship was charging through a blind spot in history. The lookouts were freezing and optics blind. The captain was off the bridge. The wireless was jammed with social trivia. The hull was weakened by a secret fire, and the horizon was a blur of optical illusions. Every safety system that should have protected the vessel had been systematically dismantled by negligence, arrogance, or misfortune. To a criminal investigator, this accumulation of failures looks suspicious. It looks like the board was being cleared for a checkmate. The stage was set for the accident to happen with maximum lethality. The silence of the ocean was about to be broken, and the first sound would not be a cry for help, but the tolling of a bell that signaled the end of the world. The prey was in the kill zone, and the hunter, shrouded in the mirage and the black water, was ready to strike. The warnings had all been ignored. Now, only the impact remained. To suggest that the most famous maritime disaster in history was not an accident, but a clandestine act of war, requires us to step away from the comforting simplicity of the official narrative and enter the murky waters of forensic speculation. The central hypothesis of this criminal investigation is as chilling as it is precise. The RMS Titanic was struck by one or more torpedoes fired from a German U-boat, likely the U-20, or a similar vessel patrolling the North Atlantic. This theory argues that the iceberg was, at best, a secondary participant, a convenient obstacle that forced the ship to maneuver, or perhaps merely a passive observer to a man-made execution. The true agent of destruction, according to this view, was a submerged predator that utilized the cover of darkness and the confusing optics of the mirage to deliver a fatal blow to the pride of the British Empire. The foundation of this theory rests on the acoustic footprint of the disaster. As we have noted, the official inquiry settled on the narrative of a grazing collision, a prolonged scraping of ice against the starboard hull. Yet, the physics of such a collision are problematic. Ice is hard, but steel is resilient. For an iceberg to slice open a 300-foot gash or a series of discontinuous slits across 5 watertight compartments, the force required would be immense, and the sound would have been a deafening, continuous shriek of metal being torn apart. However, the testimony that haunts this investigation tells a different story. Survivors like Major Puchin and Quartermaster George Rowe spoke of a sudden jar, a vibration, and distinct percussive reports. Explosions was the word used by several witnesses, a word that was sanitized in the official transcripts to bumps or scrapes. But a torpedo impact is unmistakable, a sharp, violent detonation followed by a shockwave that travels through the ship's structure like a bell ringing. If we examine the weapon itself, the theory gains a terrifying plausibility. The German torpedoes of 1912 were typically 45 cm or 50 cm diameter weapons carrying a wet gun cotton warhead. They were not designed to vaporize a ship, but to shatter its hull integrity. A torpedo striking the Titanic below the waterline would not create a clean hole. It would create a localized catastrophe. The explosion would blow inward, buckling the steel plates and, crucially, popping thousands of rivets along the seams for yards in every direction. This whip effect would explain why the flooding was so rapid and uncontrollable. The Titanic was designed to withstand a breach, but she was not designed to withstand a high-explosive shockwave that compromised the structural binding of the hull plates across multiple compartments simultaneously. The sheer volume of water that entered the ship, filling the forward peak number 1, number 2, and number 3 holds, and boiler room 6 almost instantly, matches the hydraulic violence of a torpedo strike far better than the passive friction of ice. Furthermore, the behavior of the mystery light seen by passengers and the crew of the Californian aligns disturbingly well with submarine tactics of the era. Submarines in 1912 were diesel-electric hybrids. They ran on diesel engines on the surface to charge their batteries and switched to electric motors when submerged. They had a very low profile, sitting almost flush with the water. The strange, flickering lights seen by the Californian, lights that did not resemble a conventional steamer, could easily have been the Morse lamp of a U-boat commander trying to signal his presence to a supply vessel, or perhaps signaling a warning after the attack had gone wrong. The rocket sightings are also contentious. Titanic fired distress rockets, yes, but some witnesses on the Californian described seeing rockets that didn't go high enough, implying they might have been the muzzle flashes of a deck gun or signal flares from a much smaller vessel closer to the water. The motive for such an attack is the engine that drives this criminal theory. Why would Germany risk war? The answer lies in the doctrine of asymmetric warfare. Germany knew it could not outbuild the Royal Navy in surface ships. The British industrial base was too strong, but the submarine was the great equalizer. By sinking the Titanic, the largest, most celebrated ship in the world, Germany would send a message of terrifying vulnerability to London. It would prove that no amount of British steel or money could protect their assets from the invisible reach of German engineering. It was a psychological operation as much as a military one, and if the attack could be blamed on an iceberg, Germany would achieve the strategic victory of humiliation without the diplomatic cost of war. It was the perfect crime, an assassination in the dark, with nature framed as the killer. This theory also offers a logical explanation for the otherwise inexplicable behavior of the Titanic's crew in the final moments. Why did Captain Smith order the engines to half ahead after the collision? Standard procedure for a collision is to stop the ship to assess damage. Moving forward drives water into the hull faster. But if Smith believed he was under attack, his instinct would be to run, to maneuver, to escape the kill zone of a submarine that might be reloading for a second shot. This brief resumption of speed, which accelerated the sinking, looks like negligence in the context of an iceberg. In the context of a torpedo attack, it looks like a desperate evasive maneuver. Similarly, the confusion on deck, the lack of a general alarm, and the muted evacuation orders could be interpreted as an attempt to prevent panic, while the officers scanned the water for a periscope, terrified that the lifeboats would be machine-gunned if they were lowered too soon. Skeptics, of course, argue that the absence of a torpedo wake is the fatal flaw in this theory. Torpedoes in 1912 were powered by compressed air, leaving a visible trail of bubbles. Lookouts Fleet and Lee saw no wake. However, in the pitch-black conditions of that moonless night, with the optical distortions of the mirage and the calm water, a white streak might have been invisible until it was too late, or obscured by the bow wave of the ship itself. Furthermore, electric torpedoes, which left no wake, were in development, though not widely deployed. Could a prototype have been used? Or perhaps the submarine was positioned so close, lying in wait in the darkness, that the travel time of the weapon was too short to generate a visible trail before impact. The lack of visual evidence is not proof of absence, especially in a viewing environment that was already compromising human vision. There is also the matter of the missing damage. The wreck of the Titanic lies in two pieces. The bow section is buried deep in the mud, hiding the exact point of impact on the starboard side. We cannot see the wound. We can only infer its shape from the rate of the bleeding. But expeditions have noted that the damage seems to skip compartments, a pattern consistent with the hopping of an iceberg along the hull, but also consistent with a salvo of two torpedoes hitting different sections. The investigation is hampered by the fact that the primary evidence is buried under 50 feet of sediment. We are forced to rely on the circumstantial evidence of the sinking's violence. The ship didn't just sink, she broke her back. The stern rose, the keel snapped, and she tore herself apart. Structural analysis suggests that the stress required to snap the double-bottom hull was immense. A torpedo detonation weakening the keel structure would make this catastrophic breakup far more likely than simple flooding stresses. As we assemble these pieces, the image that emerges is not of a tragic accident, but of a calculated ambush. The Titanic was a target of opportunity, a sitting duck for a hunter looking to make history. The theory suggests that the iceberg was indeed there. Perhaps the submarine commander used it as cover, or perhaps the Titanic swerved to avoid the ice and presented her broadside to the torpedo tubes. The convergence of the two threats, the natural and the man-made, created the perfect storm. The iceberg provided the noise and the confusion. The torpedo provided the lethal puncture. And in the chaos that followed, the truth was swallowed by the Atlantic, leaving only the official story to float to the surface. It is a hypothesis that turns the victims into casualties of war and the survivors into witnesses of a crime so vast that the world simply refused to believe it could happen. The dossier is open, the theory is laid out, and the evidence, though rusted and scattered, begins to whisper a darker truth. The dawn that broke over the North Atlantic on April 15, 1912, revealed a seascape of horrific emptiness. The great ship was gone, replaced by a drifting archipelago of deck chairs, cork life jackets, and the frozen dead. As the RMS Carpathia steamed through this debris field, picking up the traumatized survivors, the official narrative was already beginning to solidify. The world was being told of a tragic collision with an iceberg, a story of natural misfortune that fit neatly into the headlines. But amidst the blankets and the hot coffee on the rescue ship, a different vocabulary was emerging, a collection of whispered observations that did not align with the story being written by the press. Before the lawyers and the politicians could sanitize the record, the raw, immediate testimonies of the survivors painted a picture of the disaster that was far more violent and far more suspicious than the one we have accepted as truth. This was the brief window where the evidence of a crime was still visible, before it was buried under a century of myth. The primary piece of evidence in this preliminary investigation is the acoustic footprint of the disaster, preserved in the initial accounts of those who were closest to the impact. While the iceberg theory relies on the sound of grinding, a long, agonizing screech of metal tearing against ice, a significant number of witnesses described a sensation that was distinctly percussive. Major Arthur Puchin, whose military background made him a credible witness to the sounds of structural trauma, was explicit in his initial descriptions. He did not speak of a scrape. He spoke of a heavy thud, a tremendous jar that felt like a blow delivered by a massive hammer. This sensation of a sudden violent shock was corroborated by passengers in the lower decks, who described the ship trembling or shivering as if it had struck a solid wall. This is the hallmark of an explosive impact, a transfer of kinetic energy that shakes the entire frame of the vessel, distinct from the localized friction of a collision. Even more damning were the accounts from the men in the boiler rooms, the witnesses standing at ground zero. Fireman George Kemish, who was off duty at the time of the impact, reported hearing a heavy thud followed by a grinding sound. But it was the sequence of events described by lead fireman Frederick Barrett in Boiler Room 6 that offers the most compelling forensic clue. Barrett testified that the water did not seep in, it burst in. He described a section of the hull giving way with such violence that it sent him scrambling for the watertight door. This description of a sudden, catastrophic failure of the steel plating is consistent with the blast radius of a torpedo warhead, which would shatter the rivets and buckle the plates inward, creating an instant gaping aperture rather than a narrow slit. The speed of the flooding in Boiler Room 6 was anomalies. It suggested a hole far larger than what a glancing blow from an iceberg should theoretically produce. Then there is the evidence of the mystery ship, a phantom vessel that haunts the margins of every inquiry, but has never been satisfactorily identified. We know the SS Californian was stopped in the ice some miles away, but the testimony of the Titanic's officers suggests there was a third vessel, much closer, positioned between them. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall, scanning the horizon with binoculars, swore he saw the two masthead lights of a steamer approach the Titanic, getting as close as 5 miles before turning and disappearing into the darkness. Boxhall was an experienced navigator. He knew what a ship looked like. Yet this vessel displayed erratic behavior. It approached, it hovered, and then it vanished. In 1912, a submarine running on the surface to recharge its batteries would present a low, confusing silhouette that could easily be mistaken for a small steamer at a distance. When the Titanic began to fire distress rockets, this mystery ship did not respond. Instead, it seemed to slink away. Was this the U-boat retreating after delivering its fatal strike? Its commander realizing the magnitude of what he had done? The distress rockets themselves provide another layer of forensic inconsistency. The crew of the Californian reported seeing rockets, but they described them as low-lying, barely rising above the horizon. The distress rockets carried by the Titanic were designed to soar high into the air and burst with a loud report. The discrepancy between the high-altitude signals fired by Boxhall and the low-altitude flashes seen by the Californian suggests two disturbing possibilities. Either the atmospheric distortion was so severe that it compressed the visual field, or the flashes seen by the Californian were not distress rockets at all, but the muzzle flashes of a deck gun, or the signal flares of a submarine attempting to communicate with its own fleet. The confusion over these lights, were they white, were they colored, were they rhythmic, creates a fog of war that is typical of a naval engagement, not a simple maritime accident. Furthermore, we must examine the physical behavior of the ship during the sinking, specifically the structural failure that occurred in the final moments. The breakup of the Titanic was a violent, chaotic event. The official theory posits that the weight of the stern simply snapped the keel. However, survivors reported a series of explosions deep within the ship just before the final plunge. These were dismissed by the inquiry as boilers breaking loose or machinery crashing through the bulkheads. But naval engineers have questioned whether falling machinery could produce the distinct, thunderous reports described by witnesses. A different interpretation suggests that the structural integrity of the ship had been compromised not just by the water, but by the initial explosive trauma to the keel. If a torpedo had struck the ship amidships or near the bow, the shockwave would have weakened the spine of the vessel, predisposing it to the catastrophic snap that severed the stern. The violence of the breakup, described by some as sounding like a roar of thunder, echoes the acoustic signature of a vessel whose structural backbone has been shattered by high explosives. The documentation, or lack thereof, surrounding the disaster also bears the hallmarks of a cover-up. In the immediate aftermath, there was a rush to control the narrative. The US Senate inquiry and the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry were convened with remarkable speed, but their scope was curiously limited. They focused intensely on the lifeboats and the ice warnings, but they aggressively steered witnesses away from descriptions of explosions. When a witness used the word explosion, the questioners would often rephrase it as rumbling or breaking. It was a subtle linguistic sanitization of the testimony. Additionally, the logbooks of the Titanic went down with the ship, but the logbooks of the nearby ships, including the Californian and the Mount Temple, contained gaps and inconsistencies regarding their positions and the signals they saw. It is as if the official record was being edited in real time to remove any suggestion of a third actor on the stage. Perhaps the most poignant piece of preliminary evidence is the reaction of the passengers themselves in the first hour. Many of the men, particularly those with military or industrial backgrounds, did not believe they had hit an iceberg. They gathered in the smoking rooms, discussing the jar and the thud with a skepticism that belied the official explanation. They knew what a collision felt like, and this felt different. It felt precise, it felt mechanical. These conversations, reconstructed from memoirs and letters, reveal a pervasive sense of unease that the crew was hiding something. The stewards were ordered to downplay the damage, to tell passengers it was a precautionary muster. This level of secrecy went beyond crowd control. It smelled of containment. They were managing a crime scene, ensuring that the victims remained calm while the evidence sank beneath them. As the sun rose higher on April 15th, the Titanic was gone, leaving only the debris and the questions. The physical evidence, The shattered hull, the twisted steel, the fragments of the weapon was falling slowly through the water column, coming to rest in the eternal darkness of the abyssal plain. But the testimonial evidence was alive, huddled in the lifeboats, shivering in the cold. It was a chorus of voices speaking of thuds, tremors, and mystery lights, of a ship that didn't just sink, but was broken. These were the first pieces of the puzzle, the jagged edges of a truth that the world was not ready to accept. The investigation had barely begun, and already the official story was leaking water. The iceberg was the convenient answer, the easy answer, but the evidence, fragmented and freezing, pointed to a cold, hard fact. The Titanic had been assaulted, and the weapon that killed her had left its mark not just on the steel, but on the memories of every soul who survived the night. To reconstruct the final hours of the Titanic is to assemble the mechanism of a ticking bomb, gear by intricate gear, until the moment of detonation. In a standard criminal timeline, we look for the point of no return, the specific second where intent meets opportunity. On the night of April 14th, that timeline did not begin with the collision. It began with a shift change, a routine handover of duty that inadvertently sealed the vessel's fate. At 10:00 p.m., the watch on the bridge changed hands. First Officer William Murdoch, a man known for his quick reflexes and steady nerves, relieved Second Officer Charles Lightoller. It was a formal, quiet ritual conducted in the dim light of the wheelhouse. They spoke of the cold, which was now biting enough to freeze breath in the throat, and they spoke of the ice. "We might be up around it now," Lightoller remarked before leaving the deck. It was a casual observation, but in retrospect, it reads like the handover of a death sentence. Murdoch was now the man in charge of the trap, standing alone in the dark, peering into a horizon that was actively conspiring to hide the danger. High above the bridge, in the exposed misery of the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee began their 2-hour watch. They were the eyes of the ship, but they were visually handicapped. Without binoculars, locked away in a cabinet whose key had been taken off the ship by a transferred officer, they were forced to rely on naked vision in an environment that had stripped away all depth perception. The sea was so flat, it looked like a painted floor. The sky was so clear the stars blurred with the ocean. This was the optical ambush we discussed earlier. In this sensory deprivation tank, a submarine sitting low in the water, painted in naval grey, would be indistinguishable from the void. Fleet and Lee were looking for the white reflection of bergs, but they were blind to the matte silhouette of a predator. Their shivering silence in the nest was the quiet before the gunshot, a period of vulnerability where the ship was effectively flying blind into a combat zone. Down in the wireless room, the timeline of isolation was reaching its climax. At 10:55 p.m., the Californian stopped in the ice field just 10 to 20 miles away, made its final attempt to warn the Titanic. Cyril Evans, the Californian's operator, tapped out his message. "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." It was a casual, fraternal warning, the kind that might have saved 500 lives. But on the Titanic, Jack Phillips was deafened by the loud signal from the relay station at Cape Race. He was busy sending a backlog of society gossip and stock trades. Shut up, he signaled back. "I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Evans, rebuffed and tired, switched off his set at 11:30 p.m. The timeline here is critical. At the exact moment the submarine, if we accept the theory, might have been maneuvering into its firing position, the Titanic's only potential savior went offline. The silence that followed was total. The ship was now screaming into the void and no one was listening. On the bridge, the tension was internal. Murdoch was pacing. He knew the ship was steaming at 22.5 knots, a speed that many later critics would call criminal. But was it recklessness, or was it a calculated risk to clear the danger zone as quickly as possible? If Smith had shared intelligence of a U-boat threat, maintaining top speed would be the standard defensive protocol against a submarine, which in 1912 would struggle to catch a liner moving that fast. The speeding crime might actually have been a desperate attempt at evasion. As 11:30 p.m. passed, the ship was cutting through the water with the momentum of a freight train. The passengers were asleep, the band had finished playing, and the lights in the public rooms were extinguishing one by one. The ship was quieting down, preparing for the graveyard shift. Then came the pivot point. 11:39 p.m. Frederick Fleet saw something. It was not a white mountain, but a black mass that blotted out the stars directly ahead. It didn't shimmer. It just existed as a void in the darkness. He rang the warning bell 3 times. The sharp metallic clang of the death knell. He grabbed the telephone to the bridge. "What did you see?" asked Sixth Officer Moody. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet replied. "But was it? In the torpedo theory, this dark mass could have been the conning tower of a U-boat that had surfaced to vent fumes or take a final bearing, or perhaps the dark shape of the iceberg used as cover." The reaction on the bridge was instantaneous. Murdoch shouted his famous order, "Harder starboard." He intended to swing the ship's stern clear of the obstacle. He also ordered full astern, a command to reverse the engines. This specific sequence of orders is where the forensic timeline becomes murky and suspicious. Reversing the engines kills the rudder's effectiveness. A turning ship needs propulsion to steer. Murdoch knew this. Why would an expert seaman cripple his own turn? Unless he wasn't just trying to avoid a stationary object. If Murdoch saw a wake, a torpedo track, his instinct might have been to stop the ship to let the weapon pass ahead, or to turn the bow away to present a smaller target. The port-around maneuver he attempted was complex and desperate. As the ship began its agonizingly slow turn, the bow swung left. The dark mass loomed closer. For 37 seconds, the ship hung in limbo between safety and destruction. It was a lifetime. At 11:40 p.m., the impact occurred. But let us look at it closely. The ship did not hit the object head-on. She brushed past it. If it was an iceberg, the ice would have scraped along the starboard side. But the damage report suggests something punchier. The sizzle of the water described by some, the thud described by others, it all happened in a blur. In our criminal reconstruction, this is the moment the trigger was pulled. As the Titanic exposed her broadside during the turn, the most vulnerable profile a ship can present, the submarine commander sitting in the dark off the starboard bow would have had a perfect firing solution. 1 torpedo, maybe 2, fired at close range. The scraping sound could have been the torpedo tearing through the outer plates before detonating, or the sound of the ship grinding against the ice after the explosion had already compromised her steering. The immediate aftermath on the timeline is a study in confusion. 11:41 p.m. The engines stopped. The silence that fell over the ship was heavier than the noise. Murdoch closed the watertight doors, sealing the fate of the men in the boiler rooms. Captain Smith burst onto the bridge. "What have we struck?" he asked. "An iceberg, sir," Murdoch replied. But did they exchange a look that said otherwise? The ship had stopped. The unsinkable vessel was dead in the water. In a naval ambush, this is the kill-confirm moment. The enemy watches the target halt, listing slightly. The timeline of the sinking had begun. The pumps were activated, but they were fighting a losing battle against a wound that was mathematically fatal from the first second. By midnight, the reality of the crime had set in. Thomas Andrews had done his calculus. The ship was doomed. The timeline shifts from navigation to evacuation, from the bridge to the lifeboats. But the critical window from 11:39 to 11:41 remains the smoking gun. The missed warnings, the blinded lookouts, the dead radio, the desperate turn, the suspicious impact. It was a perfect cascade of failures, so precise that it defies the laws of probability. Nature is rarely so organized in its malice. A killer, however, is exactly this efficient. The reconstruction of the night leaves us with the chilling image of a ship that was herded, blinded, and then executed in the span of 60 seconds, while the world slept, unaware that the 20th century had just begun its long, violent history of warfare against civilians. The bomb had gone off. Now the evidence was beginning to sink. In every flawed investigation, there is a singular moment that refuses to align with the official conclusion, a jagged piece of the puzzle that no amount of narrative force can make fit. It is the discontinuity, the glitch in the matrix of the accepted truth. In the case of the Titanic, amidst the confusion of the collision and the flooding, there exists a specific operational decision made in the minutes following the impact that defies all standard maritime logic. It is an action so counterintuitive, so reckless in the face of an iceberg, that it demands a darker explanation. That moment occurred roughly 10 minutes after the collision, when the great engines of the ship, having been silenced, suddenly roared back to life. The ship, with a mortal wound in her starboard bow, began to move again. The official inquiry glossed over this event, treating it as a minor panicked error, but to a forensic investigator, it is a blazing red flare. Standard protocol for a ship that has struck a stationary object is to remain dead in the water. Moving forward increases the hydraulic pressure against the hull, forcing water into the breach with exponentially greater violence. It acts like a scoop, driving the ocean into the damaged compartments faster than any pump could ever expel it. Captain Smith, a veteran of 40 years at sea, knew this physics intimately. He knew that if the ship was damaged, stillness was his only ally. And yet the telegraphs on the bridge rang out the order. Half ahead. The massive propellers began to turn, churning the black water, and the Titanic slowly gathered speed, moving forward for several minutes. Why? Why would a seasoned commander drive a sinking ship forward? If we accept the iceberg theory, this action is an inexplicable lapse of judgment, a senile mistake that accelerated the sinking by perhaps an hour. But if we view this through the lens of the torpedo theory, the fog clears instantly. If Captain Smith or his officers believed they had been struck by a weapon, if they thought a submarine was lurking in the darkness off the starboard beam, then remaining stationary was not a safety protocol, it was a suicide note. A stationary ship is a sitting duck for a second torpedo. In naval warfare, the only defense against a submarine after an initial hit is to move to zigzag, to spoil the firing solution of the attacker who is reloading his tubes. The order to slow ahead or half ahead reads like a desperate evasive maneuver, a reflex of a captain who believes he is under active assault. This period of movement creates a terrifying discontinuity in the passenger experience. Survivors reported the vibration returning to the floorboards, a sensation that brought a wave of false hope. "We are moving again," they whispered to one another in the corridors. "It must not be serious." They went back to their cabins, took off their life belts and poured another drink. But down below, the reality was catastrophic. The forward motion was tearing the ship apart. The water pressure against the damaged plates was immense, buckling the bulkheads that might have otherwise held for hours longer. By driving the ship forward, Smith was unknowingly forcing the Atlantic into the belly of his vessel, effectively pumping the ship full of water. When the engines finally stopped for the second final time, the bow was already noticeably lower. The gamble, if it was an evasion, had failed, and the cost was time, the one resource they could not afford to lose. Simultaneously, another discontinuity was playing out on the horizon, one that haunts the testimony of the surviving officers. Fourth Officer Boxhall, who was on the bridge, was fixated on the lights of a ship nearby. He didn't just see a light. He saw the masthead lights of a steamer perhaps 5 or 6 miles away. He was so convinced of its presence that he didn't just fire rockets into the void. He fired them at the ship, trying to signal it specifically. And then he saw something that chilled him. As the Titanic stopped, the mystery ship turned. It didn't turn toward them to offer assistance, it turned away. It showed its stern light and vanished into the darkness. This behavior is utterly alien to the code of the sea. No merchant captain, seeing a liner in distress, turns his back. But a submarine commander, having delivered a crippling blow and seeing the target listing, would retreat to a safe distance to watch the kill or to escape detection before dawn broke. The retreat of the mystery ship is the silence that speaks volumes. This discontinuity extends to the behavior of J. Bruce Ismay during these critical minutes. Witnesses placed him on the bridge during the engine restart. Was he the one urging Smith to move? Was he obsessed with the idea of reaching Halifax or New York, refusing to accept the death of his ship? Or was he too gripped by the fear of an attack? Ismay's subsequent behavior, his silence, his isolation on the Carpathia, his refusal to testify about certain conversations, suggests a man who witnessed something that broke his understanding of the world. If he knew the ship was running from a shooter, his survival instinct in the lifeboat, often painted as cowardice, takes on the shade of a man escaping a war zone. He wasn't just leaving a sinking ship, he was fleeing a crime scene. The damage assessment itself provides the final piece of this illogical puzzle. When Thomas Andrews returned from his inspection, he was pale, his face a mask of disbelief. He told Smith the ship had an hour, maybe two. But Andrews was looking at the rate of flooding after. The ship had resumed moving. He was calculating the depth of the ship based on the water that had been forced in during that fatal run. Did Andrews realize that the movement had sealed their fate? There is a gap in the conversation between Smith and Andrews, a moment where the realization must have hit them. The maneuver to escape the attacker had actually killed the ship. The unsinkable design relied on the water pressure remaining static. By moving, they had exceeded the design parameters of the bulkheads. The discontinuity here is the realization that the captain's defensive reflex became the ship's executioner. As the engines died away for the last time, a heavy, suffocating silence reclaimed the vessel. The vibration that had reassured the passengers was gone, replaced by the hiss of steam venting from the funnels, the sound of the ship's life force bleeding out. The lights of the mystery ship were gone. The hope of reaching shallow water was gone. The Titanic was now a dead weight, drifting in the current. The officers on the bridge had to pivot instantly from evasion to evacuation, a psychological shift so jarring, it likely contributed to the disorganized launch of the first lifeboats. They had wasted 20 priceless minutes trying to outrun a ghost, and now they had to pay for that time with human lives. This 10-minute window of movement is the smoking gun of the investigation. It is the behavior of a victim who knows they are being hunted. It contradicts every protocol for an accidental collision. It suggests that on the bridge of the Titanic, the fear was not of the water rising from below, but of the darkness stretching out around them. They were running, and in running, they tripped the final lock on their own destruction. As the ship settled, the water creeping up the letters of her name, the passengers began to realize that the silence wasn't peace. It was the end. And out in the dark, the thing that had scared the captain into making his fatal mistake was gone, leaving no wake, no trace, only the echo of a turned back and a vanishing light. The discontinuity was closed. The tragedy was now inevitable. For 73 years, the crime scene lay undisturbed, protected by a mile of water and the crushing weight of the Atlantic. It was a cold case in the truest sense, locked away in a freezer that preserved the steel bones of the victim, while the world above forgot the questions and remembered only the romance. But in 1985, the silence was broken. When Dr. Robert Ballard and his team guided the camera sled Argo over the seabed, and the first ghostly image of a boiler appeared on the screen, the investigation entered a new forensic phase. We were no longer relying on the terrified, contradictory memories of freezing survivors. We had the body, and like any modern homicide detective arriving at a scene decades late, the first task was to photograph, map and analyze the physical remains for signs of trauma that did not fit the accidental profile. The lens of the present does not weep, it measures, and what it has measured in the debris field suggests that the Titanic did not die peacefully. The arrival of deep-sea technology, the remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, the side-scan sonar, the 3D mapping submersibles changed the texture of the mystery. These machines, tethered by fiber-optic umbilicals to motherships miles above, allowed us to prowl the decks of the sunken liner like ghosts. We could look into the officers' cabins, we could inspect the davits where the lifeboats were launched, we could drift down the grand staircase. But for the criminal investigator, the sightseeing is irrelevant. The focus is on the wound. And here the ocean has conspired to aid the cover-up. The bow section of the Titanic, where the fatal impact occurred, plowed into the prehistoric mud of the ocean floor with the force of a falling skyscraper. It is buried up to its anchors, hiding the starboard side, the very location of the alleged iceberg collision, under 50 feet of sediment. The smoking gun, the gash itself, is concealed. To a skeptic, this is bad luck. To a conspiracy theorist, it is the ocean keeping the German Navy's secret. However, technology allows us to look at what is visible, and the anomalies are striking. One of the most significant findings of modern metallurgy concerns the quality of the ship's steel and rivets. Samples recovered from the wreck and subjected to spectroscopic analysis revealed that the steel was high in sulfur, making it brittle in freezing temperatures. The official narrative uses this to explain why the iceberg caused such damage. The steel shattered rather than bending. But let us flip the forensic perspective. Brittle steel is also uniquely vulnerable to the high-velocity shockwaves of an explosion. A torpedo warhead detonating against the hull would send a supersonic fracture heavily propagating through this brittle material, shattering the plates like ceramic. This aligns perfectly with the survivor testimonies of a shivering impact and the rapid, catastrophic failure of the watertight compartments. The metallurgy doesn't just support the iceberg theory, it makes the torpedo theory lethally plausible. The rivets tell an equally violent story. The hull plates of the Titanic were held together by millions of iron rivets. Forensic analysis of recovered hull sections shows that many of these rivets were sheared off, their heads popped by immense internal pressure. The official theory calls this unzipping, caused by the iceberg's friction, but in a controlled explosion, the overpressure wave travels faster than the structural flex of the steel. It pops the rivets before the plates have time to deform. The debris field is littered with these popped rivets. Are they the shrapnel of a collision, or the residue of a detonation? Furthermore, some of the hull plating found in the debris field shows evidence of buckling outwards, not inwards. While air pockets exploding during the sinking can explain some of this, an external torpedo blast also creates a complex pressure wave that can push steel in counterintuitive directions, especially as the water rushes in to fill the void. Modern sonar mapping of the entire debris field has provided a crime scene sketch that spans square miles. The distribution of the wreckage is chaotic, but it reveals the violence of the breakup. The stern section, which sits some distance from the bow, is utterly devastated. A mangled cathedral of steel. The official physics suggests the stern imploded as it sank because it was not fully flooded. But the degree of destruction is profound. The keel is twisted in ways that suggest a structural failure far more traumatic than simple gravity. If the ship's spine was weakened by a torpedo impact amidships, perhaps a second shot that didn't fully penetrate but compromised the girder strength, the catastrophic breakup at the surface becomes a mechanical inevitability. The sonar shows a ship that was torn apart, not just broken. We must also look at the rusticles, the eerie, stalactite-like formations of iron-eating bacteria that drape the wreck. They are slowly consuming the evidence, dissolving the steel into dust. This biological clock adds urgency to the investigation. The fingerprints of the collision, the specific striations of ice on steel, or the chemical residue of explosives are being eaten away. However, modern sub-bottom profilers, a type of sonar that can see through the mud, have attempted to image the buried bow. These ghostly, fuzzy images show the distortion of the hull beneath the sediment. They hint at a damage pattern that is not a continuous gash, but a series of punctures. This dotted line of damage is the hallmark of the iceberg skipping theory, but it is also the exact pattern a submarine commander would hope for, a breach that bypasses the watertight defenses by compromising multiple chambers simultaneously. Then there is the evidence of what is missing. The remotely operated vehicles have scoured the debris field for decades. They have found shoes, china, boilers, and safes, but they have never found the piece of the iceberg. This sounds absurd, of course. Ice melts. But if the ship hit an iceberg hard enough to sink it, chunks of ice would have been embedded in the wreckage, leaving scars or deformation patterns distinct from the seabed impact. More importantly, we haven't found a single piece of the mystery ship. If the vessel seen by the Californian was a steamer that ignored distress calls, it sailed away. But if it was a submarine that suffered a mishap, perhaps a collision with the Titanic's bilge keel during the attack, there might be fragments of a different type of steel or German naval equipment hidden in the mud. The vastness of the search area means that a small piece of foreign wreckage could easily be overlooked, mistaken for Titanic debris. The lens of the present also includes the human element of the researchers themselves. The early expeditions were driven by discovery and later by salvage. It is only recently that a true forensic mindset has been applied. Experts like naval architect Roger Long have used the wreck's condition to challenge the sequence of the breakup. The grounding theory, that the Titanic actually rode up onto a shelf of ice, has been proposed to explain the damage to the double bottom. But a torpedo striking the keel would produce similar damage to the bottom plates without the need for a massive, invisible underwater ice shelf. The experts are debating the mechanics of the trauma, and every new paper that questions the glancing blow narrative opens the door a little wider for the weaponized alternative. As the ROVs drift silently through the darkness, their LED lights illuminating the grand ruin of the 20th century, they are patrolling a grave that refuses to be silent. The technology has stripped away the romance. The Titanic is not a legend down there. It is a massive, rusting structure that failed catastrophically. The cameras show us the violence. They show us the doors blasted off their hinges, the glass unshattered in some places and vaporized in others. They show us a crime scene that has been tampered with by gravity, pressure, and time. But the steel remains, and as long as the steel remains, the possibility persists that the jagged hole hidden in the mud was not carved by nature, but by a machine built in a shipyard in Kiel, designed to kill empires. The robots watch, impartial and cold, waiting for us to ask the right questions of the silent metal. The evidence is there suspended in the rust, waiting for a verdict that may never come. If we align the rusted tumblers of this historical lock, the door swings open to reveal a scene not of natural tragedy, but of industrial homicide. The strongest hypothesis, the narrative that best fits the jagged edges of the forensic evidence and the survivor testimony, is that the Titanic fell victim to a pincer movement of bad luck and malice. In this reconstruction, the iceberg was not the primary killer. It was the anvil against which the hammer struck. The true agent of destruction was a German U-boat, likely a U-19 class vessel, operating under the cloak of the optical mirage, which used the confusion of the ice field to execute a lethal, perhaps experimental strike on the British Leviathan. This is the version of the story where physics, politics, and testimony finally sing in the same key. Imagine the North Atlantic at 11:35 p.m. as a three-dimensional chessboard. The Titanic is the queen, moving aggressively, exposed. The ice field is the terrain, dangerous and confusing, and the U-boat is the knight, hidden in the blind spot. The German commander, tracking the liner's lights for hours, realizes the ship is entering the kill zone of the ice. He does not need to chase her. He only needs to wait. He positions his vessel near the track of the major bergs, using their thermal mass to mask his presence and their bulk to confuse any sonar listening devices, primitive as they were. As the Titanic approaches, the black mass seen by Frederick Fleet is not the tip of an iceberg, but the darkened silhouette of the U-boat's conning tower or the hull of a vessel running on the surface to charge batteries, caught by surprise by the liner's speed. When Fleet rings the bell, Murdoch orders the harder starboard turn. The Titanic begins her slow, agonizing swing to port. This maneuver saves her from a head-on collision with the ice, but it presents her broadside, the flat of the target, to the waiting submarine. It is the moment of maximum vulnerability. The U-boat commander, seeing the massive hull fill his periscope or sight, gives the order. A single torpedo is fired. It is set for a shallow depth, aiming to strike just below the waterline to maximize flooding. The weapon streaks through the dark water, invisible in the lack of phosphorescence. The time to impact is seconds. The collision described by the passengers, the thud, the jar, the shiver, is the warhead detonating against the starboard bow plates. The explosion is muffled by the millions of gallons of water pressing against it, transforming the blast into a massive hydraulic hammer. It does not tear a long gash. That is the myth created to explain the flooding. Instead, the shockwave punches a hole perhaps only 10 feet wide, but it shatters the rivets along the vertical seams for 50 feet in either direction. The steel plates, brittle from the cold and the high sulfur content, unzip violently. The structural integrity of the first 5 compartments is compromised instantly. The water doesn't seep in. It is driven in by the explosive displacement. The grinding sound heard by some is the ship's own structure screaming as the girders warp from the blast. or perhaps the vessel scraping against the ice. After, the torpedo has already done its work, the pilot having lost steerage due to the shock. This hypothesis elegantly solves the problem of the sinking speed. Air clean cut from an iceberg would result in a relatively linear rate of flooding, but the Titanic flooded with a terrifying exponential speed in the first hour. This is consistent with blast damage, where the internal bulkheads are not just bypassed by water pouring over the top, but are structurally weakened at their base by the initial explosion. The fire in Bunker 6 had already softened the steel. The torpedo strike shattered it. The water roared into the boiler rooms because the walls holding it back had been kicked in by a bomb. This explains why the pumps, which should have bought them time, were overwhelmed immediately. The ship wasn't bleeding, she had been gutted. The mystery ship seen by the Californian and the Titanic's officers falls into place as the submarine itself, or perhaps a tender ship refueling it. The low-lying rockets seen by the Californian were the submarine signaling its success or its extraction. The erratic movements, approaching, stopping, then turning away, mirror the tactical behavior of a U-boat confirming the hit, and then submerging or retreating on the surface to avoid detection as the area became crowded with rescue signals. The fact that this vessel turned its stern to the dying Titanic and fled is the behavior of a culprit, not a bystander. The lights seen by Fleet just before the crash were likely the navigation lights of the sub, switched on in a panic or seen through the distortion of the mirage. Crucially, this theory explains the political silence. In the days following the disaster, British naval intelligence would have pieced this together. They would have seen the reports of explosions, the mystery ship, and the rapid sinking. But the cabinet in London would have faced a nightmare scenario. Accusing Germany of sinking the Titanic would demand a declaration of war. The Royal Navy was not ready. The public was traumatized. The stock market would collapse. It was a checkmate situation. The only move was to swallow the truth. The iceberg narrative was constructed not just as an explanation, but as a diplomatic shield. It allowed Britain to mourn without mobilizing. It allowed Germany to avoid a war they might not have wanted to start so clumsily. The two empires, enemies in everything else, became allies in the cover-up, united by the need to keep the peace for 2 more years. The strongest hypothesis, therefore, is that the Titanic was the first casualty of the Battle of the Atlantic, 2 years before it officially began. She was not a tragic victim of nature's indifference, but a strategic target in a shadow war. The accident was a successful operation. The negligence of the captain was the confusion of a man under fire, and the 500 dead were not drowned by the sea, but sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical stability. The iceberg was there, yes, but it was the torpedo that turned the Titanic from a damaged ship into a tomb. The pieces fit, the timeline holds, and the silence of the ocean suddenly feels less like peace and more like the quiet of a crime scene after the shooter has holstered his weapon and walked away into the night. To prosecute a history-altering crime requires not just a smoking gun, but the systematic dismantling of the alibi. And the alibi for the sinking of the Titanic is colossal, immovable, and frozen in time. It is the iceberg. To the vast majority of maritime historians, naval architects, and forensic engineers, the torpedo theory is a seductive fiction, a phantom born of trauma and paranoia. The contra-hypothesis, which is simply the accepted historical record, argues that the disaster requires no villains, no submarines, and no conspiracies to explain the carnage. It posits that the crime scene is exactly what it appears to be, a tragic intersection of Edwardian hubris, primitive metallurgy, and the chaotic physics of a collision at sea. The defense of the accident theory is robust, grounded in the tangible reality of the North Atlantic, and it challenges the crime narrative at every turn. The primary argument for the defense is the visual evidence, or rather, the lack of it. A torpedo in 1912 was not a subtle weapon. It was a machine powered by compressed air, venting a distinct, frothy trail of exhaust bubbles as it raced toward its target. This wake was the terror of every sailor in the Great War. It was a white arrow pointing directly back to the shooter. On a night as calm as April 14th, with the sea surface acting like a black mirror, A white wake would have been glaringly obvious, even without binoculars. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee may have been blinded by the lack of contrast, but they would have likely spotted a streak of phosphorescent bubbles cutting through the dark water. Their testimony was consistent. They saw a black mass, but no streak, no flash of a launch, and no telltale disturbance in the water until the collision itself. The absence of this visual signature is a formidable hurdle for the prosecution. Furthermore, the archives of the Imperial German Navy, while purged and fragmented, have been scoured by historians for decades. There is no smoking memo, no logbook entry from a U-boat claiming the kill, and no post-war confession from a guilt-ridden commander. In the years following 1912, and certainly during the hostilities of World War I, such a victory would have been a powerful propaganda tool or a dark secret whispered among veterans. The silence from the German side is absolute. Skeptics argue that a conspiracy of this magnitude, involving a submarine crew, the German Admiralty, and potentially British officials covering it up, would be impossible to contain. Someone always talks, a stoker, a signalman, a clerk in the War Ministry. The fact that no deathbed confession has ever surfaced suggests that the secret doesn't exist because the crime never happened. The forensic defense also leans heavily on the metallurgy of the ship itself. The brittle steel finding, which the crime theory uses to explain the shattering effect of an explosion, is used by mainstream experts to explain the iceberg damage without the need for a bomb. The rivets of the Titanic were wrought iron, containing high levels of slag. When the ship sideswiped the iceberg, the immense friction didn't need to cut the plates. It simply needed to exceed the sheer strength of the rivet heads. The unzipping of the hull seams is perfectly consistent with a long, grinding impact that popped the fasteners one by one, opening the plates just enough to let the water in. This dotted line damage pattern matches the flood rate perfectly. Naval architects argue that a torpedo, a single point of high explosive impact, would have created a massive, localized hole, but not necessarily the distributed damage across 5 compartments that was observed. The iceberg, with its uneven, jagged underwater spurs, is the only object capable of inflicting a skipping wound that breaches multiple distinct sections of the ship in a single pass. The acoustic evidence, too, has a counter-argument. The explosions heard by survivors are interpreted by the defense not as ordnance, but as the agonizing death throes of the ship's internal machinery. As the bow dipped and the water rushed into the hot boilers, the thermal shock could have caused catastrophic failures. Cold seawater hitting a red-hot furnace creates a steam explosion of immense violence. Furthermore, as the ship tilted, massive engines, cargo and grand pianos broke loose and smashed through bulkheads. These internal crashes would sound exactly like explosions to terrified passengers on the upper decks. The thud, described by Major Pushin, could simply be the acoustic transmission of the massive underwater mass of the berg striking the bilge keel. A deep, resonant impact that feels like a detonation because it shakes the entire frame of the vessel. The mystery ship sighting is also dismissed by the defense as a case of misidentification and atmospheric distortion. The Californians saw a ship, yes, but the defense argues it was likely a third merchant vessel, perhaps the Norwegian sealer, Samson, which was illegally hunting in the area, and therefore had every reason to turn off its lights and flee when rockets were fired. The low rockets seen by the Californian were simply the Titanic's distress signals seen from a great distance, distorted by the same super-refraction that hid the iceberg. The atmospheric conditions that night were a funhouse mirror. Attempting to deduce criminal intent from the flickering light seen through a thermal inversion is, they argue, forensic overreach. Finally, the behavior of Captain Smith and the crew is defended as the standard if flawed seamanship of the era. The half-ahead order, which the crime theory paints as an evasive maneuver, is viewed by historians as a confused attempt to limp toward Halifax or the light of the Californian. It was a mistake, tragic and fatal, but it was born of desperation, not tactical evasion. The lack of a general alarm was a deliberate choice to prevent panic, a standard procedure on passenger liners. The suppressed warnings were simply the result of an overwhelmed wireless system and a hierarchical culture that didn't prioritize ice reports. This was not a conspiracy of silence, It was a cascade of incompetence. The contra-hypothesis rests on the principle of Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. A ship steamed at full speed into a known ice field on a moonless night. It hit an iceberg. It sank. To add torpedoes, spies, and government cover-ups is to add unnecessary layers of complexity to a tragedy that is fully explained by human error and nature's indifference. The defense argues that we want it to be a crime because a crime implies meaning. A crime implies a villain we can blame. An accident is terrifying because it is random. It means that the finest technology of the age was defeated by a chunk of frozen water. Accepting the iceberg is accepting our own vulnerability, and yet even as the defense rests, the uneasy silence remains. The accident fits the facts, but it fits them loosely. It requires us to accept a lot of coincidences. The missing binoculars, the dead radio, the perfect mirage, the brittle steel, the misread rockets. It asks us to believe that the Titanic was the victim of a perfect storm of bad luck. The official story is a clean, sanitized narrative that comforts us with the idea that the tragedy was inevitable. But in the quiet of the archives, the nagging questions persist. The defense has a strong alibi, but alibis can be fabricated. The iceberg was certainly at the scene of the crime. But was it the murderer, or was it just the weapon that was left behind to frame the sea? The jury is still out, and the verdict depends entirely on which shadow you choose to believe. The assassination of the Titanic began with a bell. At 11:39 p.m., high in the freezing solitude of the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet grabbed the lanyard of the warning bell and rang it 3 times. The sound was sharp, metallic, and desperate, cutting through the wind that had been rushing past their ears for hours. It was the signal for object dead ahead, but in the context of our investigation, it was the opening shot of the ambush. Fleet then grabbed the telephone connecting the nest to the bridge. "What did you see?" the voice of 6th Officer Moody asked from the warmth of the wheelhouse. Fleet's reply has echoed through history. "Iceberg right ahead." But in the terrifying confusion of that moment, with the optical mirage distorting the horizon and the adrenaline flooding his system, did Fleet see a mountain of ice? Or did he see the dark, matte hull of a surfacing machine blocking their path? The distinction is the difference between an accident and a crime. And the 37 seconds that followed were the most critical in maritime history. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch faced a decision that would be analyzed for a century. He was the officer of the watch, the man solely responsible for the ship's safety. When the warning came, he did not hesitate. "Harder starboard," he shouted to Quartermaster Hitchens. It was a command to turn the wheel as far as it would go to the left, intending to swing the ship's massive bow to the left and her stern to the right. Simultaneously, he ordered the engines to be thrown into reverse, or at least stopped. This is the moment where the tactical analysis becomes grim. If Murdoch believed he was facing a stationary iceberg, the maneuver was a standard, if desperate, attempt to sideswipe the obstacle. But if Murdoch had spotted a torpedo track, a streak of fire in the water, or the silhouette of a vessel, his reaction takes on a different logic. Turning the ship was an attempt to comb the tracks, to turn parallel to the incoming weapon, to minimize the target profile. Or tragically, it was the maneuver that exposed the ship's long, vulnerable flank to a shooter waiting in the dark. The ship, moving at 22 knots, fought against her own momentum. The rudder was small for a vessel of her size, and for several heart-stopping seconds, she refused to turn. She plowed forward, straight toward the black mass. The distance closed 500 yards, 400, 300. To the men on the bridge, the obstacle must have looked like a wall growing out of the sea. This delay, this agonizing lag between the command and the response, is the window of execution. It was the time it took for a torpedo to traverse the final distance. The bow slowly, grudgingly began to swing to port. The horizon shifted, the stars wheeled overhead, and for a fleeting second, it looked as if they might clear it. The bow passed the object. The danger seemed to slide by, and then the impact. It was not the dramatic Hollywood-style crash of a head-on collision. It was something more insidious. It was a series of concussions along the starboard side, running from the forepeak back to the boiler rooms. To the casual observer, it might have sounded like a scrape, but to the ship herself, it was a disembowelment. Deep below the waterline, the steel plates were being subjected to forces they were never designed to withstand. If this was ice, it was a jagged spur acting like a can opener. But if this was a weapon, it was the detonation of warheads against the hull. The shockwave hammered the steel, popping rivets like buttons off a shirt, shattering the brittle iron and opening seams in a dotted line of destruction. The water didn't leak in, it exploded in. It entered Boiler Room 6 with the force of a fire hose, knocking men off their feet and sending them scrambling up the escape ladders. This was not a passive breach, it was a violent invasion. The crime was committed in less than 10 seconds. The weapon, whether ice or iron, had struck the fatal blow. The ship shuddered, a sensation described by passengers as rolling over 1,000 marbles. Then she steadied. The engines stopped. The noise of the machinery died away, replaced by the terrifying sound of high-pressure steam venting from the funnels. A screaming roar that drowned out all conversation on the upper decks. This was the silence of the kill. The Titanic lay dead in the water, drifting slightly north, her momentum spent. The assassin, if there was one, had delivered the strike and vanished into the night. The iceberg, if it was the culprit, had drifted aft, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had arrived. Murdoch, pale and shaken, reached for the lever to close the watertight doors. He pulled the switch, and deep in the belly of the ship, massive steel doors descended, sealing the compartments. It was a reflex action, a standard safety procedure, but it was also the locking of the tomb. By sealing the doors, he trapped the water and the truth inside the affected sections. The pumps were started, but the mathematics of the murder were already undeniable. Thomas Andrews, summoned from his cabin, began his inspection. He moved through the labyrinth of the ship, reading the signs like a forensic pathologist examining a fresh corpse. He saw the water rising in the mailroom, the squash court, the boiler rooms. He did the mental arithmetic that no one else wanted to do. 5 compartments breached. The ship could float with 4. The equation equaled death. But the climax of the crime was not just the impact, it was the realization of the cover-up. As Captain Smith received the damage report, a strange lethargy seemed to take hold of the command structure. There was no general alarm, no announcement to the passengers, no organized drill. It was as if the officers were paralyzed by the enormity of what had happened, or perhaps by the realization of what had hit them. If Smith knew they had been torpedoed, the shock would have been compounded by the knowledge that they were alone in a war zone, unprotected and vulnerable. The decision to keep the passengers in the dark wasn't just crowd control, it was information containment. They were managing a disaster that had political implications far beyond the loss of a ship. They were guarding a secret that would go down with them. The final, fatal choice came minutes later, the decision we scrutinized in the timeline, the order to move ahead. As the ship limped forward, forcing the Atlantic into her open wounds, the tragedy transformed into a catastrophe. The climax of the event wasn't the sinking itself, that was the aftermath. The climax was this specific window of violence and decision from 11:39 to 12:00. It was the moment the technology failed, the leadership faltered, and the enemy, be it nature or man, won. The unsinkable ship had been mortalized. The lights were still burning, the band was preparing to play, and the champagne was still cold in the glasses, but the Titanic was already a ghost. She had been executed. The water rising in the spiral staircase was the executioner's hood being pulled over the victim's head. In the quiet of the wireless room, Jack Phillips began to tap out the distress call. CQD, CQD, come quick, danger. It was a plea for help sent into the blind night. But the signal was not just a cry for rescue. It was the first piece of evidence in the investigation. It marked the time of death. The unsinkable narrative was shattered. The Edwardian dream was drowning. And out in the dark, watching the lights of the great liner tilt and fade, something was waiting. The deed was done. The weapon had found its mark. The greatest maritime mystery of the 20th century had just been born in blood and ice water. The ship was dying, but the questions were just beginning to breathe. When the great ship finally slipped beneath the surface at 2:20 a.m., the violence of the destruction was replaced by a silence that was, in many ways, more terrifying than the noise. The roar of thunder that had accompanied the breaking of the hull faded instantly, swallowed by the black Atlantic. In its place, a new sound began to rise, a sound that survivors would later describe as a chant or a hymn, though it was neither. It was the collective voice of 1,500 people stranded in the freezing dark, floating in water that was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. In the clinical language of a casualty report, these were victims. But in the context of our investigation into a potential state-sponsored crime, they were something far more tragic. They were collateral damage. They were the pawns swept off the board in a geopolitical game they didn't even know they were playing. The human consequences of that night cannot be measured merely in numbers. They must be measured in the terrifying intimacy of the final minutes, where the grand abstractions of empires and navies collapsed into the singular, brutal struggle for a breath of air. The environment into which they were cast was lethal. The water was not just cold, it was a physical assault. At that temperature, the shock of immersion causes an involuntary inhalation of water, a gasp reflex that drowned many before they could even scream. For those who managed to keep their heads above the surface, buoyed by the white cork lifebelts, the cold began a systematic shutdown of the body's functions. It was a slow, agonizing execution. The extremities went numb, the heart rate spiked and then plummeted, and the mind slipped into a delirium that some survivors mistook for peace. This was the reality of the accident. If the ship had been torpedoed, if the flooding had been accelerated by a weapon, then every minute stolen from the evacuation timeline was a minute of life stolen from these people. The half-ahead order, the lack of a lifeboat drill, the suppressed ice warnings, each of these decisions, whether born of incompetence or conspiracy, was a sentence of death by hypothermia. Among those struggling in the water were men of immense power and wealth, individuals who had spent their lives believing that money could insulate them from the indignities of the world. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship, was found later, his body crushed by soot and debris, his pockets filled with a fortune in cash that was now worthless. Benjamin Guggenheim, having dressed in his finest evening wear to go down like a gentleman, vanished entirely, his final act of stoicism becoming a legend that masked the horror of his end. But the ocean made no distinction between the millionaire and the stoker. The unsinkable Molly Brown, watching from a lifeboat, described the scene not as a tragedy of the rich, but as a massacre of the human spirit. The rigid class structure that had governed every minute of the voyage dissolved in the water. In death, the velvet ropes were cut. However, the injustice of the night was not entirely egalitarian. The survival statistics reveal a crime of demographics. The third-class passengers, trapped in the bowels of the ship by complex corridors and, in some cases, locked gates, suffered a devastation that bordered on genocide. The Sage family, traveling to Florida to start a new life with their 9 children, was wiped out completely. 11 members of one family erased in a single hour. Imagine the terror of the parents, John and Annie, trying to herd 9 terrified children through the tilting, flooding labyrinth of the steerage decks, only to find the way to the boats blocked or the boats already gone. Did they know they were dying because a U-boat commander wanted to test a torpedo? Did they know they were dying because the British Board of Trade hadn't updated its lifeboat regulations in 20 years? Their deaths were not just a tragedy, they were a systemic failure of protection, a betrayal by the very civilization they were trying to join. The suffering extended to the survivors in the lifeboats, who were forced to become the audience to this horror. They sat in their wooden shells, drifting just a few hundred yards away, listening to the cries of their husbands, fathers, and brothers. The psychological trauma inflicted in those hours is incalculable. Men like Second Officer Lightoller, balancing on the overturned collateral B, had to physically fight off drowning swimmers to keep their precarious raft from swamping. It was a lifeboat ethics scenario played out in the dark, where survival demanded a ruthlessness that would haunt them forever. The decision of most lifeboats not to return, driven by the fear of being swamped, is often cited as cowardice. But in the context of an attack theory, was it also fear of the monster still lurking in the dark? Did the quartermaster in Molly Brown's boat refuse to go back because he was afraid of the drowning crowds, or because he was terrified that the submarine would surface and finish the job. The arrival of the Carpathia at dawn brought rescue, but it did not bring closure. As the survivors were hauled aboard, the magnitude of the loss became a physical weight. The deck of the rescue ship became a landscape of widows. Women who had dined with their husbands just hours before now sat wrapped in blankets, staring at the empty horizon, waiting for boats that would never come. The silence that fell over the Carpathia was heavy with shock. But back in Southampton, the consequences were spreading like a shockwave. The city was the home of the crew. Nearly every street in the working-class districts lost a father, a son, or a brother. The Titanic widows became a defining demographic of the city, a generation of women left destitute by a disaster that happened 3,000 miles away. If the ship was sacrificed to prevent a war, these families paid the reparations with their livelihoods. The human consequences also involved the distortion of memory. The survivors were immediately pressured to conform to the heroic narrative. The press wanted stories of "Nearer, my God, to thee," and gentlemen stepping back for ladies. They did not want stories of officers shooting passengers, of locked gates, or of explosions. The trauma was sanitized for public consumption. Men who survived were often branded as cowards, receiving white feathers in the mail, their lives destroyed by the stigma of having lived when so many died. Bruce Ismay, who saved himself in a collapsible boat, was vilified as the villain of the piece, a convenient scapegoat for a disaster that was far larger than one man's ego. He spent the rest of his life in seclusion, a ghost haunting his own estate, forbidden from speaking about the secrets he might have known. Was his silence the result of shame, or was it the condition of his survival? The tragedy of the Titanic is often romanticized, turned into a backdrop for love stories and parables about hubris. But when we view it through the lens of a crime, the romance evaporates, leaving only the cold, hard residue of injustice. The 500 people who died were not martyrs. They were victims. They were killed by a convergence of technological arrogance, regulatory negligence, and, if our theory holds, a covert act of aggression that the world refused to acknowledge. They froze to death in the middle of the ocean while the governments of Europe played a game of diplomatic chess. The image of the unsinkable ship is powerful, but the image of the frozen bodies drifting in the wreckage is the truth. It is the human cost of the cover-up. As the sun rose higher on that Monday morning, the Carpathia turned her bow toward New York, carrying the living away from the dead. The ocean, indifferent and vast, began to wash away the debris. The deck chairs scattered, the cork lifebelts drifted in the current. The bodies slowly dispersed, but the emotional scar remained. For the families of the dead, there would be no justice, only a lifetime of what-ifs. For the survivors, there would be the nightmares of the screaming silence. And for history, there would be a question that refused to sink. Were these people casualties of an accident, or were they the first civilian victims of a war that had not yet been declared? The water closed over the crime scene, sealing the evidence in the deep. But the human echoes of the disaster would resonate for generations, a reminder that the price of secrets is almost always paid in blood. The aftermath of a crime is rarely a period of clarity. It is a time of construction, where the chaotic, bloody reality of the event is dismantled and rebuilt into a narrative that society can tolerate. In the case of the Titanic, this reconstruction took place not in a shipyard, but in the hearing rooms of New York and London, where the official inquiries were convened to determine the cause of the disaster. To the casual observer, these proceedings appeared to be rigorous interrogations of the facts, led by solemn men in stiff collars seeking the truth. But to a criminal investigator examining the Torpedo hypothesis, the inquiries of 1912 resemble something far more sinister. They look like a grand jury convened not to indict a killer, but to bury the weapon. The speed with which they were assembled, the selectivity of the witnesses, and the aggressive dismissal of contradictory evidence all point to a concerted effort to establish the iceberg theory as the only permissible history, effectively sealing the crime scene with a gavel stroke. The American inquiry, led by Senator William Alden Smith, began at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel just days after the survivors landed. Smith was widely mocked by the British press as a backwoodsman who didn't know the difference between a bow and a stern. But his lack of nautical sophistication made him a dangerous loose cannon. He wasn't part of the maritime club. He didn't know the unwritten rules of silence. He asked blunt, uncomfortable questions. He obsessed over the mystery ship. He pressed the crew about the binoculars. He demanded to know about the explosions. In the transcripts, you can sense the tension as White Star officials and British officers tried to navigate his erratic, probing curiosity. Smith was accidentally stumbling toward the crime. He sensed that the story of the ice didn't add up, that the timeline was too compressed, and that the behavior of the crew was too secretive. However, without the technical vocabulary to pin them down and facing immense diplomatic pressure to wrap up the proceedings, Smith ultimately retreated to the safe harbor of negligence and speed. He barked at the shadows, but he never found the bite. The British inquiry, however, was a different animal entirely. Held in the acoustic cavern of the Scottish Drill Hall in London and presided over by Lord Mersey, it was a masterclass in establishment control. Lord Mersey was a man of the Empire, a safe pair of hands chosen to navigate a crisis that threatened the reputation of the British Merchant Marine and the Board of Trade. The conflict of interest was blindingly obvious. The Board of Trade, whose outdated regulations had allowed the Titanic to sail with insufficient lifeboats, was essentially investigating itself. From the opening gavel, the objective was clear: exonerate the system, blame the dead captain gently, and reinforce the act of God narrative. The possibility of a German attack or even a catastrophic structural failure caused by internal negligence was a path that Mersey ensured remained closed. The handling of the witnesses provides the clearest evidence of this judicial containment. When surviving crew members or passengers tried to describe the breakup of the ship, the moment the stern rose and the keel snapped, they were often corrected or dismissed. Second Officer Lightoller, the most senior surviving officer and a company man to his corps, testified that the ship sank absolutely intact. This was a lie. Lightoller knew the ship had broken. Hundreds of people saw it. Why lie? Because admitting the ship broke in half implies a catastrophic structural failure, a weakness in the keel that opens the door to theories of explosions or poor construction. A ship that sinks intact is a victim of flooding. A ship that snaps in half is a victim of violence. By establishing the intact sinking as the official truth, a falsehood that stood until the wreck was found in 1985, the inquiry effectively erased the forensic evidence of the trauma that broke the vessel's back. The treatment of the explosion testimony was equally manipulative. Witnesses who used the word were guided by skilled barristers to redefine their experience. Explosion became rumbling. Thud became scraping. The inquiry sanitized the vocabulary of the disaster, removing the linguistic markers of a weapon attack. When the lookouts, Fleet and Lee, were questioned, the focus was obsessively on the lack of binoculars, a convenient bureaucratic failure that explained their blindness. The inquiry spent almost no time exploring the optical conditions, the mirage, that might have hidden a submarine, nor did they seriously entertain the possibility that the black object was anything other than ice. They built a box called Iceberg, and they forced every piece of testimony to fit inside it, trimming off the jagged edges that didn't align. Perhaps the most calculated act of the inquiry was the scapegoating of Captain Stanley Lord of the SS Californian. The inquiry concluded that the mystery ship seen by the Titanic was the Californian, and that Captain Lord had sat idly by while 500 people died. This conclusion destroyed Lord's career and reputation, but in the context of a cover-up, it was a stroke of genius. By pinning the identity of the mystery ship on the Californian, the inquiry eliminated the third ship from the narrative. If the ship seen by Boxhall was the Californian, then there was no submarine, no German raider, no unknown vessel fleeing the scene. Captain Lord became the perfect distractor, the villain whose alleged callousness absorbed the public's outrage, diverting attention away from the darker questions of what or who was actually out there in the dark. The destruction of Captain Lord was the price paid to protect the silence of the North Atlantic. The role of the British Admiralty in the inquiry also raises suspicion. They were present, watching, advising. If there was intelligence regarding German U-boat activity, it was buried in the deepest vaults of Whitehall. The inquiry avoided any discussion of naval tensions or the Titanic's status as a reserve merchant cruiser. They kept the focus strictly commercial. The questions were about bulkheads, ice patrols, and lifeboat davits. They were technical, dry, and safe. They turned a potential crime scene investigation into a regulatory review meeting. The final report, when it was published, was a document of profound dullness. It concluded that the Titanic was lost due to collision with an iceberg, brought about by the excessive speed at which the ship was being navigated. It was a verdict that blamed the dead Captain Smith for being too fast and the ice for being too hard. It was tidy, it was safe, and it was almost certainly incomplete. But the most damning aspect of the investigation was not what was said, but what was omitted. There were no questions about the fire in Bunker 6 and its effect on the hull's integrity. There was no serious forensic analysis of the debris field, obviously impossible at the time, but the lack of curiosity about the nature of the damage is telling. They accepted the 300-foot gash theory without a shred of physical evidence, because it was the only scenario that explained the sinking within the iceberg framework. They worked backward from the conclusion they needed, an accident, and filled in the gaps with assumptions. The official investigation was, in essence, the final phase of the disaster. First came the impact, then the sinking, and finally the silencing. The men in the hearing rooms draped a heavy velvet curtain over the truth, turning a scene of violent, unexplained destruction into a parable of human error. They did what empires do when they are frightened. They closed ranks, they protected their interests, and they wrote a history that allowed the world to sleep at night. They sealed the file. But in doing so, they left the door ajar for a century of doubt. They created a narrative so polished, so devoid of the messy, violent contradictions of the night, that it feels less like a finding of fact and more like a negotiated settlement with reality. The gavel came down, the case was closed, and the Titanic was officially surrendered to the ice. But the transcripts remain, full of ghosts that refuse to be cross-examined into silence. Over a century has passed since the Titanic vanished, and in that time, the ship has ceased to be a mere vessel of steel and rivets. It has transmuted into a cultural monolith, a symbol as recognizable as the cross or the crescent. We have built a cathedral of meaning around the disaster, a secular mythology where the Titanic represents the ultimate cautionary tale of human hubris, checked by the awesome, indifferent power of nature. We tell ourselves that it was the pride of the builders, the arrogance of the captain, and the blindness of the age that conspired to sink the unsinkable. This narrative is comfortable. It serves a moral purpose. It teaches us to be humble before the elements. But if the crime theory holds true, if the ship was not humbled by nature, but assassinated by a machine of war, then the meaning of the Titanic shatters and reassembles into something far darker, far more cynical, and infinitely more tragic. Under the torpedo hypothesis, the Titanic is no longer a parable of pride. It is a story of innocence slaughtered by calculation. The lesson of the disaster shifts from the dangers of speed to the ruthlessness of empires. In this light, the ship becomes the first true battlefield of the 20th century, a precursor to the Lusitania, and the unrestricted submarine warfare that would define the horrors of the Great War. The 500 dead are transformed from victims of an accident into the first civilian casualties of a conflict that had not yet been declared. They were not martyrs to the sea. They were collateral damage in a Cold War that turned hot for one specific night. This shift in perspective strips away the romance of the string quartet and the women and children first nobility, replacing it with the cold, mechanical reality of a target acquisition and a firing solution. It turns the golden age of Edwardian travel into a kill box. Consider the legacy of safety that emerged from the disaster. The sinking led directly to the formation of SOLAS, the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, and the establishment of the International Ice Patrol. Regulations were rewritten to ensure that every passenger had a lifeboat seat, that radios were manned 24 hours a day, and that shipping lanes were moved south to avoid the ice. These were monumental achievements that have undoubtedly saved countless lives in the decades since. But there is a profound, biting irony here. If the Titanic was sunk by a torpedo, then the entire modern safety framework of the maritime world is built on a lie. We spent a century fortifying ships against icebergs because we blamed the ice, while the true predator, the submarine, went unaddressed until it unleashed hell in 1914. The International Ice Patrol has spent billions of dollars tracking bergs that may have been innocent bystanders, while the geopolitical mechanisms that allowed a state to attack a civilian liner were left to fester until they exploded into global war. The cultural impact of the disaster also takes on a ghostly pallor when viewed through the lens of a crime. For generations, we have consumed the Titanic as a romantic tragedy. We have watched movies where lovers embrace on the prow, where the disaster serves as the dramatic backdrop for a love that transcends class. We have turned the sinking into a stage for human emotion, softening the horror with violin music. But if the ship was murdered, this romanticization feels like a violation. It feels like we are telling a love story in a crime scene that has never been cleaned up. The focus on the majesty of the ship and the tragedy of the loss distracts us from the brutality of the event. A torpedo strike is not tragic, it is violent. It is an act of aggression that demands justice, not nostalgia. By turning the Titanic into a legend, we have inadvertently participated in the cover-up, burying the sharp, jagged reality of the attack under layers of celluloid dreams and museum exhibits. Furthermore, the new meaning of the case forces us to re-evaluate the 2 years of peace that followed the sinking. If the British government suspected a German attack and chose to suppress it, they made a utilitarian calculation of terrifying proportions. They weighed the lives of 500 citizens against the cost of a premature war, and they chose the silence. In this interpretation, the Titanic was a sacrificial lamb. Her destruction bought the world 24 months of relative peace before the guns of August finally spoke. Does this make the cover-up a noble lie? Or does it make the leaders of 1912 accomplices after the fact? It is a moral dilemma that resonates with every modern government decision to hide intelligence for the greater good. The Titanic becomes a case study in the burden of state secrets, asking us how much truth we are willing to sacrifice to maintain the illusion of stability. The wreck itself, lying 2.5 miles down, has become a contested space where this battle for meaning is slowly being lost to time. The ship is dying. The rusticles, communities of iron-eating bacteria, are consuming the steel at a rate of hundreds of pounds a day. The crow's nest is gone. The deck of the gymnasium has collapsed. The officers' quarters are caving in. As the physical structure disintegrates, so does the evidence. We are approaching a horizon where the Titanic will no longer exist as a tangible object, but only as a stain on the ocean floor. When the last piece of steel dissolves, the crime scene will be gone forever. This impending disappearance adds a frantic urgency to the alternative theories. We are racing against biology and entropy to read the final clues before the ocean reclaims the weapon. The deterioration of the wreck is the final phase of the cover-up, executed not by men but by nature itself. Yet, even as the steel fades, the case refuses to close. The Titanic has moved from the realm of history into the realm of forensic mythology. It has become the ultimate cold case, a locked-room mystery where the room is the bottom of the Atlantic. The rise of the internet and digital communities has allowed the torpedo theory and other alternative narratives to find new life. Amateur sleuths, retired naval officers, and hydrographic experts now collaborate across borders, reanalyzing the sonar data, enhancing the survivor testimonies, and building digital models of the flooding. The investigation has been democratized. The official story handed down by Lord Mersey is no longer the final word. It is merely one version of events in a crowded marketplace of ideas. The Titanic now belongs to the detectives of the future, who look at the tragedy not with reverence, but with suspicion. This shift in meaning also reflects our own modern anxieties. In 1912, the world feared nature. Today, we fear unseen enemies, state-sponsored terrorism, and government cover-ups. The torpedo theory resonates with us because it mirrors the complexities of our own time. We understand what it means to be vulnerable to a sudden, invisible strike. We understand the mechanics of spin and information control. We see the Titanic not as a relic of a simpler time, but as the first modern disaster, one that combines technological failure with the dark machinations of power. The ship has become a mirror. We no longer see the Edwardian face looking back at us, but the reflection of our own paranoid, dangerous world. Ultimately, the new meaning of the Titanic case is that truth is not a fixed point. It is fluid, shaped by the needs of the survivors and the agendas of the powerful. The 500 souls who went into the water were casualties of a specific moment in time, but the story of why they died has become a living thing, mutating and evolving. If it was an accident, it is a tragedy. If it was a crime, it is an outrage. And as long as that distinction remains unproven, the Titanic will never truly sink. It will continue to drift through the collective consciousness, a ghost ship carrying a cargo of unanswered questions, sailing forever between the certainty of the ice and the shadow of the torpedo. The investigation is not over. It has simply moved from the ocean floor to the human mind, where the deepest mysteries always reside. The case remains open, and the file is still on the desk, waiting for the one piece of evidence that might finally bring the dead to rest. The final chapter of the Titanic investigation is not written in ink, but in water. It is a story that is slowly being erased by the very element that conceals it. As we stand at the end of this inquiry, looking back over the century of silence, the overwhelming sensation is not one of resolution, but of fading. The wreck, lying 2.5 miles down in the crushing darkness of the North Atlantic, is disappearing. The rusticles, those weeping stalactites of iron-eating bacteria, are consuming the physical evidence of the crime at a rate of hundreds of pounds every day. The steel plates that might bear the telltale deformation of an explosion are dissolving into fine dust, carried away by the deep ocean currents to become part of the seabed. In a few decades, the Titanic will no longer exist as a ship. It will be merely a rust stain on the ocean floor, a geological anomaly rather than a forensic object. The window to solve the case with absolute certainty is closing, and soon the only witnesses left will be the ghosts of our own speculation. This impermanence adds a profound melancholy to the mystery. It suggests that some crimes are designed to be swallowed by time. If the Titanic was indeed the victim of a state-sponsored assassination, the perpetrators have achieved the ultimate victory. They have outlasted the evidence. The U-boat commanders are dead, their logs lost or destroyed in the fires of 2 world wars. The British officials who might have sanctioned the cover-up have taken their secrets to the grave, their consciences cleared by the belief that they saved the world from an earlier conflict. The perfect crime is not one that goes unsolved. It is one that history eventually agrees to call an accident. The iceberg has become the perfect alibi because it is eternal, natural, and silent. It does not confess and it cannot be cross-examined. It simply exists, a cold white monument to the official version of the truth. Yet, the phantom theory persists because the human heart rebels against the randomness of the accident. We struggle to accept that 1,000 lives can be extinguished by a chance encounter with a block of ice. There is a dark comfort in the idea of a conspiracy, because a conspiracy implies intent, and intent implies meaning. If the ship was torpedoed, the deaths were not senseless. They were a sacrifice. They were the first blood paid in the defining struggle of the 20th century. The victims become soldiers in a war they didn't know they were fighting. This narrative grants them a strange kind of dignity that the accident theory denies them. They were not just unlucky, they were targeted. They were important enough to be hunted. As we drift away from the scene of the crime, letting the freezing water close over our investigation, we are left with the image of the ship as she is now. The grand staircase is a gaping void. The chandeliers are gone and the shoes of the victims lie in pairs in the mud, marking the places where bodies once rested before the sea consumed them. These empty shoes are the silent jury that has been waiting for a verdict for over 100 years. They walked the decks of a ship that was promised to be unsinkable, and they stepped off into an abyss created by the collision of human arrogance and perhaps human malice. The silence of the wreck is not peaceful. It is heavy with the weight of the unanswered. It is the silence of a library where the most important book has been stolen. The ocean, however, is indifferent to our questions. It keeps its secrets with a patience that is terrifying to behold. The North Atlantic does not care about the politics of 1912, the naval ambitions of Germany, or the insurance claims of the White Star Line. It only cares about the pressure and the cold. It is a vast blank canvas upon which we project our fears and our theories. Tonight, the water above the wreck is just as dark and just as calm as it was on that April night. The stars look down with the same cold detachment. A ship sailing over that spot today, equipped with radar and sonar and GPS, is still just a fragile bubble of light, moving through an endless hostile dark. The technology has changed, but the vulnerability remains. We are still passengers on a fragile vessel, sailing through waters that hide dangers we cannot always see. And so, we leave the Titanic where she belongs, in the twilight zone between history and myth. The torpedo theory may never be proven to the satisfaction of a court of law, but it has achieved something perhaps more important. It has forced us to look closer. It has forced us to listen to the voices of the survivors that were silenced by the official record. It has reminded us that history is often written by the people who have the most to hide. The mystery ship seen by the Californian may have sailed away into the night, but it never really left. It sails on in the imagination, a ghost ship that represents all the unknown threats that prowl the edges of our security. The explosion that Major Puchin heard is still echoing, a low-frequency vibration that disturbs the smooth surface of the accepted past. As you lay in the dark, safe in your bed, imagine the great ship resting in hers. The violence of the sinking is long over. The screams have faded, the panic has dissolved. There is only the slow, rhythmic drift of the current and the soft descent of marine snow, the organic dust that covers the wreck like a blanket. It is a peaceful end to a violent story. The Titanic has found her rest, even if the truth has not. She sleeps in the Museum of the Deep, surrounded by the other lost ships, the other unsolved mysteries, the other crimes that the ocean has washed clean. But the ocean is vast, and the Titanic is not the only secret it holds. There are other ships that vanished without a trace, other distress calls that went unanswered, other lights seen on the horizon that should not have been there. The files of the maritime world are filled with cold cases, with stories of the Lusitania, the Mary Celeste, and the warship Cyclops. Each one is a riddle written in salt and steel. The investigation into the Titanic may be pausing here, but the detective work of the deep continues. The sea is a vault, and every now and then, the door creaks open just enough to let us glimpse the shadows inside. If this investigation resonated with you, and you find a strange comfort in peeling back the layers of history's forgotten crimes, feel free to subscribe for more deep and calming explorations of the stories the ocean tries to hide. We will return to the archives, to the maps, and to the dark water, searching for the next truth that is waiting to be brought to the surface. Until then, let the mystery drift away. The case is closed for tonight, the evidence is filed, and the sea remains, as always, silent and deep. Sleep well.